Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. This is a Comprehensivist Wednesdays that we do in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. And it's always an honor to have Sanjay back doing his series on neuroscience. And today we are talking about mind, body, consciousness. So take it away, Sanjay.
Thank you, Shrikant. So today we're going to really go into continue some of the ideas that we've had recently. We've talked about several issues around consciousness and some of the challenges. I mean, consciousness is, as everyone's aware, it's a very broad topic. It really, the fact that we use one word to describe it is sort of a disservice to it because it really is more than one concept. And we went into some of that in some of the prior discussions and talks. And so this one aspect that it's multi-bodied, it's multi-faceted is very important to understand. Also, we recently talked about consciousness being multi-level. So within the brain, it actually exists in different ways. I mean, the simplest way we talked about, and I'll do a little bit of review tonight, but we talked about it being primarily two facets, and we might think of it as three facets. A physical awareness, there's a cognitive or mental awareness, and then there's a higher level cognitive awareness, which so far, as we can tell, only humans have, and that's the level of consciousness where we are aware of our own thoughts, our own higher level thoughts. So 2 or 3 levels is a minimum that we think of it of consciousness. And we're going to expand on one of those levels tonight and look into the possibility whether when we talk about our physical states of consciousness, whether the mind and body may actually be a part of that. Maybe they meld into this idea of consciousness. So consciousness has many levels. So what I wanted to do is first just do a quick recap of some of the things that we talked about. I think it was the last talk. And so consciousness minimally has 2 levels, and practically it has at least 3 levels. Again, this is a minimum of 3 levels. And what we talked about last time is that it refers to awakeness, the concept of an organism or an animal being awake, physically awake. The second level, which is much more broad, refers to awareness, that organism or animal is aware of its surroundings. So that's the external world, as well as its internal state. It's aware of its internal body, what's happening inside of it, and all of that forms its awareness. And the third level, which seems to be predominant in humans, it may be in some other primates, which is still under study. And this is where we refer to our own experiences, our conscious experiences, and our own thoughts. We are aware of our own thoughts. So this is the multi-level idea around consciousness. Now, the second bullet that we had in the last slide, I'm going to expand on that a little bit. And so we basically, when we talk about the levels, we talk about it depends on which parts of the brain are active. So in the past, we've talked about our brain really being composed of multiple smaller brains, you might say, and those smaller brains actually evolved over time. And I have a slide coming up that will describe that. So depending on which of those smaller brains or subparts of the brain are active, affects what types of consciousness we have. And this is true not just at the physical level, this is actually true with all 3 types of consciousness. Depending on which parts of the brain are active, we have various measures or various indications of consciousness. And these can be quite complex. So this is one of the reasons why it is so complicated, because we have multiple levels of the brain, and each of those levels work independently to give us ideas, to give us an understanding of the world. And depending on which ones are on or off, and it's not so simple as saying they're on or off. They're actually at different stages of on or off. So, for example, our subcortical regions, which often is called the limbic system, can be on partly. So it's not fully on. It's not in a heightened state of awareness or activity. It may be partly on or just slightly aware of the world. And the cortex may be much more aware. So you don't have simply on-off states of different parts of the brain, but you have this myriad set of grays. It's not just one gray, it's a set of grays. So that adds to the complexity. Also, these are all subjective, which leads to it making much more difficult to exactly measure what we, measure this state of consciousness. This is one of the difficulties with consciousness research, is that it's so difficult to measure that for any organism. And this also attaches importance to feedback. So whether the person can respond in any way or not. And again, this is the physical level. So whether they can respond or not helps us to understand. But there are other levels that, or other parts of the brain that which need to be on for us to respond. For example, we need to have the ability to move our muscles volitionally. Either, let's say, if somebody asks, a physician asks somebody who is thought to be in a comatose state, blink your eyelids or move your finger or say something, right? Well, all of those require muscle control. So feedback is a part of this. Now, when I talked about the brain having multiple levels and the brain being multiple, each of the multiple levels being in a state of on or off or partly on or off, this comes from basically two areas. We see this both embryologically in terms of when a fetus grows, any kind of animal fetus when it grows. We see that the actual brain, the cells that comprise the entire brain, they grow in stages, and different parts of the brain, the regions of their brain, grow at different times or begin to grow at different times. And almost the exact same pattern of growth is seen to have, or at least the evidence that we have right now, seems to show that the evolution of our brain, of the human brain, let's say, the way that the human brain evolved and the multiple portions of the brain that evolved, also evolved in almost the same pattern. And this is the pattern that I have a very simple diagram, a time-based diagram. So myelencephalon, the melencephalon, the mesencephalon, diencephalon, and the taliencephalon. These are now these words are not specific to humans. These are broad categories that are applied across many species, but some of these break down into simpler words that we use for humans. So these 5 regions are present in almost all mammals, definitely, but also even some of the not the smallest, the earliest, but some of the mid-tier and later reptiles are present. So these 5 brain structures have been around for over 100 million years, and they and also when in embryology, when a fetus grows, we see these same 5, not by these names, but we see 5 regions similar to these also develop in every fetus, and then they develop and proliferate into the full brain that we see after that infant is born. And these are encoded both in DNA, but they really are, so they're a fundamental part of how our brain operates. We have these 5 regions, and actually in higher mammals and primates, these regions somewhat have merged together. So physiologically, in terms of the physical observation of anatomy, it's difficult to tell. For example, the lower 3, the rightmost 3 on this slide, it's very difficult to separate them out oftentimes, although we can to some extent, but it becomes very difficult. And the left 2 roughly correspond to the cortex, the thinking cap that we have, and the second to the left is the subcortical, so the limbic system, when we think of it that way. Although the limbic system and the actually merges in with the cortex in many areas, so it's not as distinct. These 5 regions are not distinct in the full-grown brain, but roughly speaking, these 5 regions are important aspects to every brain. So going back to consciousness, and the reason why this idea is important is that these 5 regions, again, as I said, they come on and off at different times depending on the state of the physical state of the organism, as well as the emotional and cognitive state of the organism. So if we're sleeping, some of those regions have much less activity, and other regions are much more active. If we're speaking and communicating and interacting with others around us, or even the world around us, then more of those regions will be active. If we're in a state of heightened awareness, either shock or fear or something like that, that some of these regions will be hyper alert and other regions will be subdued and attenuated intentionally to allow us to react. And this is what earlier when you talked about Daniel Kahneman's model, two-state model, it actually refers to our brain being able to turn off some of our brain states. So when we're in a fight or flight situation, our brain literally turns off our frontal lobe, most of our frontal lobe, so it becomes much less active because that's the slower part of our brain. That's the part that does the system 2 thinking. The system 1 thinking is nearly instantaneous. It comes with a reaction, but through evolution, our brain has been molded to turn parts of itself on or off depending on the situation. So awareness, and this is again the reason why awareness and all of these ideas around consciousness are so difficult to elaborate on and even to study, because there really are a vast amount of variability that happens within the same organism over time. Again, we have parallel levels of the brain that are operating depending on the brain state. We have mental and physical states which are not completely measurable, again, because of the difficulties that we talked about. And qualia. Qualia is something that we talked about last time, where it's a extremely subjective assessment by an organism of their own conscious state. And really, there's no way to know this yet. In the future, we may find ways to measure it through imaging studies or other studies, but at this point, we have no way other than personal recall, personal communication by the person. Usually, this involves a person, because qualia, we don't see it occurring in other animals, but in the person, if the person can communicate their state of qualia, that's the only way we know that exists. So these subjective levels we're going to actually, I think, the middle part of this, and later on I'm going to expand on this slide. So the mental states currently are not measurable. It may be impossible to measure, and the physical states. So this is splitting out the second bullet in the previous slide, which talked about mental and physical states. So the mental states are not measurable currently. They're very difficult, maybe impossible to measure. Although I don't want to say impossible. At some point in the future, decades from now, we may find ways of measuring a person's mental state or an animal's mental state. But the physical states today can be measured pretty reliably, and the physical states are they form a part of our awareness. So this is where the talk tonight around mind and body really comes in. Is the physical states reference the body itself and our brain's ability to sense and, in a sense, measure aspects of our body. So there are 3 primary aspects of our body that and this is not only in human beings, this is in all mammals and even in the lower forms of organisms, that there's interoception, which is the ability of that organism to sense inside of its body certain states. So for example, if you have to urinate, if you're hungry, these are internal states that are in the body, and that we can measure, and we can come up with an understanding or a knowledge, and by that, what we mean is awareness that we have to pee, or awareness that we're thirsty, or that we're hungry, right? So these all, and there's many types of signals that we can measure through our interoception system. Second set of physical states that we can measure, that our brain can measure, is called exteroception, which these are typically the 5 senses that we talk about, although we have more than 5. In common parlance, we refer to them as 5 states, 5 senses, but all of the senses that we have all of the senses that we have, that we talk about, really measure the external world. Even our sense of smell and taste, even though they seem to be inside our body, they're really measuring things that are not within our body. They're measuring things on the surface of our body. So when food touches the surface of our tongue, or certain chemicals or molecules flow into our nostril, they're not a part of our body. They're not inside of the the skin surface of our body. So therefore, they're not inside of our body. They're still considered outside, and that's why they're part of the exteroception system. And they're measuring external sensations from the external world. They give us an understanding of what is happening around us. And the proprioception system is, again, it's measuring parts of our body, but it's measuring very different parts of our body, specifically orientation of specific body parts. If my arm is moving, if I held my arm up here, then where is my arm? Even if I close my eyes, I can basically touch my nose with both fingers or both hands without really looking at where my eyes are, because proprioception gives us the ability to, while we're moving, and even when we're not moving, even when we're stationary, to have an understanding of where our body, different parts of our body are in space. And this is very important in movement, but in other areas also. Balance is another part of this, is very important. So basically, proprioception deals with our place in space. So what that means is not only where our body is relative to itself, but also where our body is relative to the localized world around us. So are we sitting on a chair? Are we standing? That type of information also is a part of our proprioceptory system. So all of these three things together form our physical states, and our brain is always getting that information from our body, from the various parts of our body, the receptors that are throughout our body, and it's always keeping a sense in real time of where we are, what's happening inside and outside. And that gives us a sense of awareness of us in the world, of where we are in the world. For example, our exteroception system might give us a sensation of cold, and then we might realize that, we're outside and it's wintertime. So that will help us to not only see visually that it's wintertime, because we might see snow, or even if there's no snow, right? We might see that the leaves have fallen, if you live in that geographic area where the leaves fall in wintertime. So there is this merging between what our brain sees and what our body senses. And this is one of the ideas that we're going to discuss tonight, is that the mental state and the physical state, they occur independently. And that's something we're going to go a little further into later, but I just want to put that idea out for now, is that our brain's conception of what the world is, our internal world and the external world. So our brain's conception of that arises from two parts. One is from a cognitive processing of it, and also from a physical processing of it. And this is a new idea I haven't really talked about. It's actually very, it's not, so let me say this, that this is not some of the ideas in terms of the physical understanding of what the world is. Some of these are accepted very broadly. So for example, the idea that we sense temperature, and using that we integrate our place in the world. For example, we're outside and it's windy, or we're outside and it's cold. That idea is very well accepted in neuroscience, that our physical states, the measurement of our physical states from our body is a important part of our cognitive understanding of where we are. But there are other parts of this idea which are not as well accepted. They're theorized. And so we're going to go into that area to explore and see, relative to consciousness, what, where these things fit in. So again, consciousness, the three physical states, interoception, examples of these are that I'm hungry. So there's a physical sensation inside of our body, which tells us that we're hungry. My back hurts. Again, this is a physical sensation inside of the body. It may be in your muscles, it may be in the bones, it may be in ligaments or other places. Technically, you can actually have pain in other organs. For example, when people have a gallstone that's developing and becomes very significant, they have severe pain. And that is real pain, and it's felt literally inside of the body. So interoception, our interoceptory system, is a large part of what provides that information to us, that something's not right. Now, in most cases, it's not that something's not right. If you're hungry, it's not that it's not right, but basically it's something you have to attend to. If you're hungry, then your body needs food. Or if you're sleepy, that's another part. Although the sleepiness is a mixture of some of these. So I'm hungry, my back hurts. These are clearly interoceptory information that our brain gets. And exteroception, examples of these are that it's cold in here. Wherever you are, it's cold. Or I smell something. And these are examples where we are sensing the external world. Again, not inside our body, outside of our body. We're sensing something about that world. But once we do that sensing, that information gets integrated into the rest of our brain. And I want everyone to keep that idea a little bit separate, that the actual sensing part and then forming an understanding, think of those as two separate ideas. Okay, oftentimes we think of them and combine them, but in this case, we need to keep them separate because there are a lot of sub-processing that goes on from the time that we actually get a sensation that my skin feels cold temperature, and that cold temperature sensation gets sent to a low-level area of our brain. Usually it's in the pons or the brainstem. And then from there, it goes into higher order areas of the brain. And subsequently, we have a realization. Now, that realization, here's another dichotomy that I want to split out in this idea, is that one, the sensation, perception is going to arrive into the body. That perception will go into the brain, into the lower parts of the brain, and that perception will form into a sensation. Sorry, I said it backwards. So the sensation, the sensory input into our body comes into our body. It goes into the lower parts of our brain. That the sensory information then goes higher into our brain. It forms a perception. That's when we have a realization. But again, that it's not the full realization at that point that it's cold, right? Because that full realization may actually be masked. In many cases, it is masked by our brain. For example, if it's not important, our brain typically ignores it, and that information stays in our subconscious. And the third level is if that information is important, only then does it enter our conscious mind and become part of our current awareness, our conscious awareness. So just when we're talking about consciousness, I'm trying to split out and explain the at least three levels of information abstraction that occurs with something as simple as it's cold, or I feel coldness. That idea of I feel coldness coming onto our skin does actually take multiple levels and multiple paths within the brain, and oftentimes it doesn't reach our conscious awareness. For example, when we're sitting and our body physically is touching the chair. Now, before I said that, I suspect most of you are sitting somewhere. You were not aware that your bottom is literally having sensations of pressure based on your body sitting on a chair or something, right? You did not have that sensation because your brain got it. It was going into your brain. It was going into a form of perception, but it was not going into your consciousness. You were not consciously aware that the skin under your bottom, under your thighs, are touching something. Now that we talked about it, some of you, probably all of you, can sense that and have a conscious awareness of that sensation on your skin, on your thighs, but prior to that, you didn't. And that's an example where a lot of the sensations that we have don't reach our consciousness. Most of them, actually, so this is important to understand. So in terms of so this applies both to interoception as well as exteroception, and also to proprioception. So an example of proprioception is that I'm about to fall if I don't move quickly. So for example, if you're riding a bicycle, or let's say you're hiking through an unknown area in the woods, and your leg hits a stone, and your proprioceptory system will realize that your muscles made your leg move to a certain location, but something hit your leg, and later you'll have the realization it might have been a stone or a log or something on the ground, but instantly you don't have a realization of what happened. At the instant moment when your foot hits something, all that you have is a realization that your foot is not where it needs to be, that your foot is not where you commanded it to be, that there's a discrepancy between the two. And that discrepancy may lead to another sensation in your mind going into your mind that you're off balance now. So all of those things are part of the proprioceptory system. All of these things can be very, very complicated. Even something simple as hiking through the woods can involve so many different processes of the brain in terms of levels of consciousness that, so I'm trying to give different examples which elucidate more and more deeply into these three levels of our physical sensory signals that we can pick up on through our body. Now, this one point, I smell something. I'm going to focus on it later because there's an example I'm going to give, which will elaborate on that a little bit, and it's going to get again into the mind-body question and into exactly if and where consciousness fits into this. So just put a pin in that the idea that I smell something. It's a part of our exteroception system, but we're going to elaborate on that a little bit more. So now we're going to go into mind and body. And so the idea, I think many of you know, and we've talked about this in prior discussions here, is that our brain, mind, and our body are interconnected. They are physically interconnected and symbolically also interconnected. So the brain, what that means is that the brain can control specific parts of our body. The most obvious part is we can control our muscles. We can actually control our heartbeat. We can control our respiration. We can control our digestive system. Our brain actually causes our intestines to squeeze and contract to allow digestion to occur. It causes our esophagus to squeeze and contract to allow us to swallow food that we're chewing and eating. So our brain controls specific parts of our body. The sweat glands in our body, when we sweat, again, our brain is doing that. And that doesn't involve muscles, but it involves other types of receptors which our brain physically controls. So control of our body is an important part of all of this. That our brain controls, pretty much any part of our body. Another part of this is that the brain can sense the state of specific body parts or systems, organ systems. This is something that, again, should not be new to people, but we've talked about this in prior discussions. The brain can sense the state of specific body parts. So when we talked about earlier, we can sense whether we're hungry or whether we need to urinate. These are specific body parts that our brain is sensing. Also, what we mean by mind-body control is that the brain regulates the body. So when our body temperature in warm-blooded mammals, our body temperature is regulated by the brain, and it's actively regulated, which means that the brain has a way of sensing what the temperature is. Now, this actually, it's more subtle than you might think. Our body actually senses the external temperature as well as our internal temperature. And it's theorized that it senses our internal temperature in more than one location. So using all of that information, and it's not a lot of information, it's a tiny amount of information, these multiple types of temperature, it takes this tiny amount of information, and from that it decides whether our body is cold or dangerously cold, or hot or dangerously hot, and what action should be taken. But the action taken, again, is a higher order, again, not in our consciousness, that rarely reaches our sense of body regulation, temperature regulation, homeostasis. This is the word that governs all of the brain's regulatory activities around our body. Homeostasis rarely reaches our level of awareness. It does sometimes. For example, if you're running a marathon and your heart is really, really pumping, and maybe if you're about to pass out, either from pain or from exhaustion, or you can sense that your heart is pumping so quickly, and you don't like it. You feel like you need to stop running. These are all aspects of where the information within our body reaches our sense of awareness. And I'm going to go into that a little bit, what might trigger that, this information going from our subconscious mind into our conscious mind. So this is an important part of our homeostatic system. And again, most of this information all of it goes to our brainstem, the lowest regions in our brain. Most of the processing occurs in that brain and doesn't go much more forward. It does go a little bit higher. Some of these signals go to higher levels, but most of them rarely go into the regions which form our consciousness. If you subscribe to the notion that consciousness exists in our being, in our body somewhere, then it does not go to the highest levels of our brain where consciousness seems to reside. So all of these things together show that our brain and body are connected, and there are many levels of interconnection between them. And these interconnections are very important for our survival and our day-to-day functioning and our long-term functioning. Something that we've talked about previously is one of the most important purposes of our brain is the need to regulate how much energy our body has, how much energy we're expelling, using, the rates of energy usage, all of these things. So basically, this helps the lower levels of our brain kind of do predictive modeling. It's not a sophisticated, but it's a very simple predictive modeling of on the current track that I'm going. And this doesn't necessarily require thought. Okay, our brain doesn't do a lot of processing necessarily with thought. Okay, it does a lot of things in the subconscious regions in ways that we wouldn't call thought, in terms of words and ideas that can be enunciated and extrapolated out. These are very low-level processes that happen, and these are areas of research of how that information is encoded with the brain. But we know that these encodings don't appear as distinct sentences or words when they're occurring inside our brain. They're much, much lower level than that. For them to reach the level of words and sentences and ideas, those ideas have to go through further processing, and they have to go into other regions of the brain. But a lot of these ideas that, for example, when we're talking about homeostasis of the body, they don't go into those regions of the brain that formulate specific words or sentences or ideas. They're much, much lower than that. But nonetheless, the fact that they're much, much lower, they still are multimodal. They basically occur at multiple levels of the brain. Again, this is something we talked about early, that a lot of these processes and activities are happening at multiple levels of the brain. All of these that we've talked about so far occur at the brainstem. And the reason why I say most here is because if a person is literally in a coma or unconscious, then some might not be. But for a conscious person, a physically conscious person, biologically conscious person, all of these would occur in the brainstem, and they probably will be going into some of the higher regions, probably not all of the higher regions. So these are all important. And the third important point to understand here is that these are all occurring in parallel. Okay, and so when we talked about within the brain, all of these things are occurring in parallel. I explained that already, so I think hopefully everyone understands that. But what this third bullet at the bottom refers to is that all of that processing that's happening in the brain, it's believed that there's another similar set of processing that's in parallel that's also happening within the body itself, independent of the brain. And this is the part that is not accepted or understood. It's still in areas of research, and I personally don't agree completely with all of these, but this is an idea. I'm proposing it because this is an aspect of consciousness that we need to look into. This also fits into this puzzle of consciousness, so that's why I'm presenting it tonight. That the body does its own set of sensing and its own set of quote unquote understanding, and it's not a level of understanding that our conscious brain has. It's nowhere near that level of understanding, but it's a very rudimentary set of understanding that the body gets about the world around itself, about the external world as well as the internal world. Now, to give you a very simple way of understanding why this is there, why this happens, or even to believe that this happens, if you think of a very simple organism like an insect or a frog, right? Those organisms don't have very complicated brains. They definitely don't seem to have consciousness. From everything we can tell, they have no precepts of higher order consciousness that humans and primates and even the highest level mammals may exhibit. So these lowest level organisms, insects, for example, have no sense of a brain. They don't have our level of awareness of what's happening, yet they can still function. And for them to function, they have to have a level of awareness of where they are and what's happening. And so this is an example, or this is an explanation. One way to look at that is that these organisms, and again, this includes us because this doesn't disappear from us. As I said in one of the earlier slides, through the evolutionary path and through embryology, both of these views into our development have shown us that these things exist in us still today. So even though these things started in very early types of organisms, They don't disappear. Rarely do things that enter DNA just kind of completely disappear. They may be changed slightly, but rarely do they completely disappear. So these things have remained in us even till today. And this is part of the theory around why some researchers believe that there is a level of sensing or awareness that the body alone, without the mind, if you completely turn off the mind, the body to some extent will have its own sense of awareness of certain things, not a lot of things, but certain things that are important for the body to function and for the body to interact in the world. So for example, shivering is something that the body can do by itself. It doesn't need the brain. So shivering is something that can happen in the body by itself, independent of the brain. This is also a reason why, just a warning for those of you who are sensitive. I'll wave my hand when I'm done with this, but if you want to mute, if you're sensitive, but if you've seen an animal a chicken that has its head cut off, it'll continue moving and running around and doing things. And that's because even without a brain, without literally a brain connected, its body is able to sense and do a lot of things. It's able to balance literally and run around. So its body is able to balance on its own. So anyway, I'm going to, whoever muted themselves, you can unmute yourself. But I simply gave an example of where the brain and body have a connection. And when the brain isn't active, the body can act on certain ways without the brain being there. So this is a very important idea that we need to keep in this discussion, that the body does its own sensing independent of the brain, and it's in parallel with the brain. And I have 3 examples here of interoception. So when we refer to gut feel, this is really what we're talking about, that I have a gut feel about something. And again, that's a very vague phrase, and I'm not going to elaborate because it can take any number of examples. But and none of those examples are really clear to explain. So let's just leave it at gut feel. I think everyone will understand what that means. In terms of interoception, what this means is, one example that most people realize is if you go to your doctor and the doctor, hits your knee with a small rubber hammer or mallet, it causes a reflex action with your knee moving automatically. That happens without any activity from the brain. Only the spinal cord is involved. Now, the central nervous system is involved. So this is not a perfect example of it. There are other examples that are a little more complicated, which I didn't want to go into. But this is an example where the body by itself can do certain things, and it can sense certain things and take action without the brain. Proprioception is an example where if you're riding a bicycle, you can see you're aware of your surroundings. But even if you aren't aware of your surroundings, your body by itself can sense its state of balance on the bicycle, whether you're teetering left or right, or if you're in a relatively stable state of equilibrium on the bicycle at any given time. And your proprioceptory system is always able to know whether you're about to fall or not. So it can take action, and oftentimes the action it can take can be automatic, even without thinking. When you're riding a bicycle, especially if you're going very quickly, you may have realized that you can actually balance yourself quite readily without any thoughts. And there are examples you can use, although it's not. If you're in a virtual reality simulation, you can do these types of things where you can literally close your eyes and do certain types of balancing exercises, and you will be able to correctly handle everything without falling over or something like that. So proprioception is something also that many things our body can do by itself without the brain getting involved. So this slide hopefully should get you to understand that the brain and body are both important for our functioning, but our brain and body both sense the world, internal and external, separately. This is the most important part to understand, is that they both sense the world separately and independently. Okay, so mind and body, they have separate activity, and I described earlier that there can be subconscious and conscious awareness of things. So the brain and body, and the brain, mind, and the body sense our internal and external world independently. Some of that sensory input can remain at the lowest level at the brainstem level. Some of it can rise to the subconscious level, and others can rise to the conscious level. And they can exist at any of these levels, and they can go back and forth. So when I talked about you sensing your bottom, your thighs, and earlier, none of us felt it, and then after I described it, some of you may have started to be able to feel that, and then after that, after I started talking about other things, I'm sure most of us stopped sensing it again. Our body again started ignoring those sensations because, again, it was not important. Now that I mention it again, now you may be aware of it again, that you're sitting on some surface, that the skin on the bottom of your bottom is touching something, there's pressure there. So you're literally sitting somewhere. And that now is in your conscious mind. But prior to that, it was probably in your subconscious mind, or it might not even been, it may have been even lower than that and not even reached your subconscious mind. So this is an example where information flows into various parts of our mind, but information also stays within our body, and these processes happen independently. So based on this, if the information goes into our brain, and depending on how far into our brain it goes, it can form what are known as affective states. This is a more psychology and psychiatry term, but affective states are basically states that evoke response from our body somehow. So oftentimes when you see a facial expression on a person, that gives away their mood or their emotional state. If they're happy, they might have a smile. If they're really scared, their eyes may or their lips may purse, or something. Their face and even their body, different parts of the body, can actually take on certain shapes based on their affect, based on their state of mind and mood. And this is all because of this mind-body connection, and it's because the information that our brain gets about our body goes into to cause certain things. So the process of affect generation is actually not automatic. It's actually very complicated. And that actually, when I talked about earlier, that if you sense the cold, that cold goes into initially the body alone, and then it will also go into the lowest level of the brainstem. Then it may even go into the subconscious. It may even go into the conscious. Well, affect forms only when it goes into the brainstem and then the subconscious. And it doesn't have to go into the conscious, but from the subconscious, it may go outward, that information about whatever it is. Let's take the example of a fear. You saw something fearful. Well, that fear is going to create an affect state within you. And that fear will, again, go into your body. It may cause your heart rate to rise. It may go into the brainstem, which may reinforce the heart rate rising. That information may go into the lower level of our brain, subcortical region, so the amygdala. The amygdala will have a sensation of this fear, something that's causing us fear. That amygdala may then activate the brainstem and cause us to go into a heightened state of awareness and even anxiety and stress, which will be information going from our brain down into our body, forcing our body into a stress response, a fight or flight response. So that's where the amount of time it takes it's again, this happens very rapidly, but it's not where the body's doing it by itself. The brain is involved. And then after that, the brain, the subconscious mind, may actually cause an affective state where it actually comes out into our facial expression, where we show fear. So all of these things are happening rapidly, but they're all happening at different stages. So this is an example where the brain senses the body, integrates it with prior subconscious ideas that it might have. Now, here's a new idea that we haven't talked about. When the brain senses something from the body, what it's actually doing then is and this is also a part that's controversial or not fully accepted. And that's because this idea that the body has its own store or its own awareness of what's happening in the world, this is not completely accepted by everyone, but let's say that this is the case. For this discussion, we're accepting that as a given, even if it's not, because this will help us to look into consciousness a little more. So let's say that the brain then has its own, what the brain is doing. Sorry, let me start at a simpler level. There's cold temperature outside, and that cold temperature impacts and goes all around our body and our skin. And that cold temperature goes into our external respiratory system, our body has an awareness of cold. Now, if it's extremely cold, our body may begin to shiver automatically, but depending on the level, it may actually need to go to the brainstem, because a lot of times shivering is a response started by the brainstem. But if you're in such a dire situation where literally your cells start to freeze because it's such an extreme temperature, the signal may not even reach your brainstem. Your body may start to react, and your muscles may start to behave in certain ways even before that. So let's say that the body has an awareness first, and then the brain gets an awareness of the same information, the same cold sensation. So the brain has a separate awareness independent of the body. Now, if both of these sensations match, and in the case of coldness, they probably will, because it's very rare unless you have some type of disorder or some type of a disorder in your nervous system, which causes these sensations to be mixed up or to not to flow correctly. Normally in a person, the sensation of coldness that you would have in your brain, the sensation of coldness that would be in the body, would match more or less. It might not match completely, meaning the level of coldness that your body feels, the level of coldness that your brain feels, there may be a discrepancy, but in most people, both your body and your brain will think of it as a coldness, as a sensation of coldness. And so the brain will compare its own sensation of coldness with the body's sensation of coldness. And that's one of the nuances here that we're talking about, is that comparison is a higher order process, because comparison has to happen. Comparison is something that's higher. It doesn't happen in the brainstem. It will happen at a higher level. And based on that comparison, based on the extent of agreement or disagreement between the mind and the body, there may be an awareness that can arise of that signal that goes into our consciousness. So, for example, when we're sitting on the chair, our body is sensing the pressure on our bottom and the fact that our thighs, the skin under our thighs, is touching something, right? Our body senses that all of the time. It never stops sensing that. Those sensations always go into our brain, always. But those sensations have to go into perception. That perception happens at the subconscious level. And that perception rarely goes into our conscious mind. Okay, but that in certain cases, for example, if we're talking about temperature or some other types of sensations, if there's a disagreement with what the mind sees and what the body senses. So, for example, when you're spinning, okay, this is an example where this often happens, where your eyes are spinning and you're moving around in a certain way, but your vestibular system, which is part of our proprioceptory system, the balance system in our ears, that's sensing a very different thing. And so often when we get dizzy, after we're spinning and spinning and spinning, we're rotating around and around, and we immediately stop. Our vestibular system continues to feel a sensation of rotation temporarily for a few more seconds, but our eyes see that we've stopped moving. And this difference between the two will instantly cause, you might say, a startle response, which shoots into our consciousness. So we instantly become conscious of this. So even if you have your eyes closed and you're spinning around and around and around quickly, and you instantly stop while your eyes are still closed, even though you aren't aware of it, you will have an awareness pretty quickly, because that difference between the brain, the body sensation and the brain sensation will be in such a strong disagreement that information, that disagreement, will be pushed into our consciousness, because we as a being, as a living being, the reason why we have sensation is to know that something's not right? To know our position in the world, to know something about the world. So if there's a disagreement in the information we're getting about the world, that is probably important for us to know. That's the reason why awareness comes in, and that's why this information goes into our conscious mind. Now, this idea, I want everyone to put a pin in, because this idea is very important. We won't talk about this later, but this idea that awareness depends on the importance of the information, okay? And consciousness is a way of collecting information that we need to know, or important information. It's a way of gathering the most important pieces of information that is sitting all throughout our brain. Our brain is filled with information. Okay? It's always filled with information. Most of it isn't important. The fact that your feet are touching the ground, or your feet might have socks on, That's not important to us, right? But now that you think of it, it's gone into your conscious mind. It probably has, right? And it's gone into your awareness. But in a couple of minutes, it will go out of your awareness because, again, it's not important, right? If you're wearing socks or you're wearing slippers or your feet are touching the ground, that's not important for us. It's on Maslow's hierarchical scale, it's very, very low. We're not in danger from our feet touching. Although if we're dangling up in a parachute, then the sensation on our feet will be very important. The fact that our feet are not touching the solid ground, or our feet are dangling, and our feet have no sensation of solid surface beneath it. In that situation, when you're hanging for a parachute, you might have a different sensation. So it may be. So again, awareness, this idea, keep this in the mind, because in a future talk, we're going to go into this more around consciousness, because this is one of the things around consciousness that I raised this earlier, but this is the second time I'm raising this, but this is because it is important. But again, we're not going to expand on it tonight, but this is a very important idea that awareness or consciousness is a mechanism that our brain has for finding or gathering the most important, most pertinent information that it needs at any given time, right? And one example is if there's disagreement between the mind and body, what the mind is sensing and what the body is sensing. If there's a disagreement, probably there's something awry, right? Either there's something wrong with our body, that our body can't sense temperature correctly, or our senses have been confused, right? Which leads to a lot of the illusions, the optical illusion or even a physical illusion that we can have. So these illusions that we have, temporary, jar us into realizing something doesn't make sense, and it pushes this disagreement of information into our conscious mind, into our awareness. So examples here, interoception. Your body might feel, your mind might feel that I'm not really hungry, but your stomach might feel the sensation that your stomach is growling. Okay, so this is a disagreement between the two. Okay, that's a classic disagreement. Now, the reason why I chose this example is that this highlights something that we're not going to go into tonight, but it's a very important idea, and that is that some types of disorders of the mind actually have to do with this, have to do with a disagreement between the mind's notion of what is happening and the body's notion of what's happening. So this example I chose is what happens in a lot of eating disorders, or it's believed to be happening in eating disorders. This is an area of research, and some of the initial findings have supported this, but the findings, we don't have enough studies around this to conclusively say that this is exactly what's happening in eating disorders. But there seems to be one of the mechanisms in eating disorders where the brain doesn't want to eat. The conscious brain, or even the subconscious, it's actually rarely a conscious idea. People with eating disorders don't consciously not want to eat. Their subconscious or lower part of their brain doesn't want to eat. It doesn't feel the need to eat, even when their body and their stomach literally is sending signals, I need to eat, or I'm hungry. Okay, your stomach is literally growling. So this disconnect is one example where it can lead to disorders. The second sub-bullet at the bottom here is exteroception. So you might have a feeling that, my God, I'm sitting in this plane, I'm terrified. It's, like a person who's scared of flying, right? They may be sitting in an airplane. This is the first test flight that they're taking because there may be their therapist sitting with them or family member sitting with them, and they're going to try to help them to get over their fear of flying, right? And this person literally has panic inside of them. Their mind is telling them, it's really scary in this plane. How is this plane going to stay afloat? This heavy metal thing, how is it going to stay up in the air? But, by the time they realize it, the plane's already taken off, and the plane's already in level flight, and the plane is very, very smooth. And this fear that they have in their brain and the sensations that they have in their body, that this plane is very, very smooth and there's no turbulence, and it's a very relaxing environment, soothing environment. Their body is giving them a sensation that's very soothing. It's very comfortable. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's no threat around us. Their visual system also shows that there's no threat around them. So this disconnect between their feeling that an airplane is really scary, but their body giving them a sensation that I'm sitting in an airplane flying and it's not scary. This again is an example where there's disagreement. And this is an example of a phobia, where phobias can be based on these also. And in proprioception, this is an example where If you're riding a bicycle, what you're typically doing is you're looking far ahead of yourself because you want to anticipate, your mind wants to anticipate what's going to happen. And your body, to some extent, also wants to anticipate. But our body doesn't have eyes. Our body cannot access the visual information that our eyes can get, that our brain can get. So our body cannot sense the far away, distant location. All it can sense is the physical sensations from the bicycle, from the moment of how you're riding, of how the bicycle is riding up and down and bouncing, whether you're balanced properly or not, the temperature, the wind, these types of things your body can sense, and similarly your mind can sense. But your mind can get additional information. For example, what's up far ahead in front of you on the road that you're driving on, or the dirt track that you're riding on, what's far ahead of you. And if you get a sensation, if your mind gets a sensation that it's bumpy up there, your body doesn't get that sensation because your body can't see anything. So your body doesn't have that, but your mind has a sensation that it's bumpy. And so your body and your mind at that instant will have a disagreement. And in most cases, what will happen is that our mind takes over. Our mind will understand that its sense of information about the track ahead, the road ahead, is more correct. So it will override the sensation of what our body feels. Our body feels that the ground is very level right now, but we might see that there's a huge pothole, or that there's even a crater in front of us. So we have to stop, right? So our mind has this panic reaction that we need to stop quickly, but our body doesn't have that reaction because our body doesn't know there's a crater in front of us, in front of our bicycle. So again, there's going to be disconnect. So the proprioceptory system also may have a disconnect. So there can be disagreements at different levels between the mind and the body. All right. Let's pause here and let's take some Q&A. See if anyone has if everything makes sense so far.
All right, folks. Let's go ahead and do Q&A. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you have any questions, and we will go from there. Or you can raise your hand in Zoom, whatever you prefer. We're going to start. Give me just a second here. Yes, we're going to start with Bob. Bob, go ahead.
Okay, there we go. Sanjay, I believe it's been said that the brain it uses a lot of energy and experiences fatigue, does it? Or is that an illusion? Is it really the body that is fatigued? I wonder.
So the word is fatigue. I couldn't hear that clearly. You're asking about fatigue?
Which is experiencing fatigue, the body or the brain?
So that's a good example, a very good question. So fatigue is one of those things that would be experienced a bit with both. And this is an example where when we're talking about information being in both the body and the brain. So our body definitely would have fatigue because fatigue is an aspect of our muscles. It's an aspect of, and again, as you said, our energy balance, the use of energy, the amount of energy that our body has available, our brain is constantly keeping aware of that. It needs to keep aware of that because, for example, if it gets into trouble, it needs to know it has enough energy. We need to know that we have enough energy to run to evade a threat. So there are many cases where not many, all of the time, pretty much, our subconscious and lowest, even lower than our subconscious, the primordial parts of our brain is always managing the amount of energy that we have. And as part of that, and as part of higher structures, it also is keeping track of our physical state. So fatigue is one of those physical states it needs to keep track of, because if we need to escape and we're fatigued, then escaping would be more difficult. So our body gets a sense of fatigue. And fatigue is not, again, it's not simply one sensation. It's a lot of different things. And I'm not an expert and I can't go into it, but it is not simply one thing. So if you're, and so again, yes, as you said, fatigue would be the embodiment of, or realization of fatigue would occur in the brain as well as the body, both. But when the brain gets that realization, it would compare it with the body. One of the things that our brain oftentimes does is that it's whenever it has any realization of anything that the body has an awareness of also, it almost immediately tries to compare with the body. So in that sense, the eventual realizations the brain has almost always tries to make sense of it with the body. So when we have an awareness or even a subconscious awareness, usually it integrates the understanding that the brain and the body have together. Usually it's an integrated feeling. But we have to understand that prior to that, there are two separate feelings. The brain has its own, the body has its own, but they get merged eventually, very quickly soon after, but they get merged. So when we talk about the brain having a sensation of fatigue, eventually it's actually that merged sensation. So the answer is really both.
Are you saying that the brain itself can be fatigued?
So that's a different question. Okay, so I thought you were asking about the body being fatigued. So yes, the brain itself can be fatigued also. And this is one of the reasons why we have sleep. And the word fatigue can have many different connotations, right? In the context of the brain, it's not that the muscles or the actuators, the energy actuators, the brain doesn't have muscles, the brain doesn't have energy actuators. So in that sense, it won't be fatigued in the same way. But fatigue, you might say, is that its ability to take action in a ready fashion, that you can think of as being the state of fatigueness. So if a part of the body cannot take ready action, it cannot take action quickly, an action that's normally supposed to take, right? So the muscle is normally supposed to be able to move, to constrict, rapidly upon a command. So if the muscle cannot do that readily, it's in a state of fatigue. It may be a state of damage, but let's say not. Let's say it's simply a state of fatigue. That's what fatigue means for a muscle. But for a brain, if the brain is tired, and this happens with sleep deprivation and many other things, and this is the reason why sleep is so important in all animals. It's seen in spiders, it's seen in the smallest types of organisms that we can measure it in. Sleep seems to be important because this aspect of, air quotes, what we call fatigue, not muscular fatigue, but another type of fatigue the brain does have.
Thank you. Next up is going to be DLJ, followed by David. DLJ.
Thank you. Yeah. Mic sound okay? You can hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, thanks. I don't want to preempt because you might be going on to this one. So if I'm doing that, don't answer and I'll wait, right? So I get that you're looking at two angles of one overall navigation system, kind of, is what I'm hearing, right? So you've got the body is the basic sort of operating alerts, yeah, all good, and the brain is allowing an extra level of like management software coming in to provide override and so on. There's another layer, and if you're going to it, like I said, just ignore me, but there's the social events or social alerts that are going, so like being offended. So where does that's not a proprioception thing, obviously, right? So where does that kind of thing fit, right? So even when, for example, I'm living in Singapore and I'm hearing somebody say something in Hokkien or Mandarin or something, right? And I think they're insulting me, but I don't know. There's a gut feel that there's a trigger, or I think my skin tingles or something, right? So I think I might be being potentially in a threat situation, but then it turns out they're just talking loudly and talking about what they're going to eat for dinner tonight, right? And it's simply because I don't have the app, the Chinese language app, right? So there's something going on physically, but I don't, yeah. So in other words, the whole ethical layer, right? What if you're going there later, then don't have to answer now. Thanks.
Right, yeah. So yeah, when we're talking about navigation, let me just do that quickly. So yeah, there are, I mean, the physical body doesn't have a means of understanding navigation. It basically relies on balance and motion, things like that. So local navigation, not long time or long distance navigation. Very immediate navigation, the body is and the mind are both intrinsically involved in that. Now, when you're talking about emotional states of gut feel, the example that I gave earlier, and that you gave also with the Chinese language that you interpret as a possible threat, a possible insult. Well, here's where the complexity comes in, because one of the reasons why this area of cognitive theory is not accepted is that it's not so clear, or actually, let me not say it's not so clear. What actually happens is that the way our body feels can be driven by our mind. And in one of the later slides, I had a sentence that the information that it gets from our body merges in with prior information in our subconscious, and that can go back into our body to drive further states. So that gut feel that we have, may actually be a response purely to an emotional state, not to a physical state. Okay, so that may be an example where that gut feel is inaccurate. And this is something I'm going to go into later, is that gut feel is not always correct. Okay, and this is something we know. Gut feel is not always correct. It does, and it's not always incorrect either. But and you know, I won't go too much into this right now. But anyway, so gut feel is not as reliable as our thinking brain. This is one of the things that we have to understand with the field of brain science is that one of the reasons why we have these multiple layers of brains is that through evolution, what evolution did, and the reason why evolution tagged on or added on these additional brain structures, and oftentimes these additional brain structures are very large and very complicated and very expensive. Okay? The human cortex is huge relative to any other animals, and it uses a huge amount of energy. It's very expensive, and it's actually very dangerous for us to have. But the reason why evolution allows us, why it remains in us, why it's continuing to remain evolutionarily in our genome, in our DNA, is that it's much more accurate, or the higher parts of our brain is much more accurate than the lower parts of our brain. So our gut instincts, sometimes they're correct, but they're incorrect often enough that we can't survive on it. And that's the reason why insects tend to die more often, because they don't have a higher order brain. They have no prefrontal cortex. They don't even have a midbrain. And many insects don't even have a brainstem. They simply have a body. The endocrine system, our endocrine system, is a sort of early precursor to the brain. If you want to look at our survival in the world, and our ability to interact with the external world originally came about with the endocrine system. And the pituitary system is one of the simplest ways where we see this tie-in between our brain, our nervous system, endocrine system. The pituitary glands are in our near our brainstem, and that's one of the earliest regions where these two different systems converged in later insects and early reptiles. So the endocrine system was a very early method for us to make decisions, and you can say gut decisions, based on what's happening in the world. And later on, we developed a very rudimentary nervous system without a brain, an initial nervous system that was a little bit better. And then evolution gave us a small brain. So very complicated insects like spiders actually have a very small brain, not just a nervous system, they have a small brain. And that brain was even better than a rudimentary nervous system and better than an endocrine system alone. And this evolution went further and further until we developed this massive brain that we humans have, primates have, which has this prefrontal cortex, which is much better than our gut system. So in that sense, the gut is oftentimes wrong, or too many times it's wrong. That's why we usually don't rely on it as much, but it's a vestigial part of our existence. We can't get rid of it. And some of us rely on it more than others. I'm not going to say if it's right or wrong, but it's there. But in terms of the studies that we've done, our brain seems to be more correct most of the time in terms of real information in the world. But our gut feeling seems to be more correct in terms of our internal feelings. Okay, this is something that I'm going to go slightly into tonight, but not much into. If people want me to go more into that, they can maybe suggest that. I'll have a separate talk on it, but that's a whole different area. But anyway, hopefully that answers your question.
All right. Sanjay, if you'll allow me, I have to tell one story to DLJ connected with these folks speaking different language, telling, and your reaction to it. I have this friend who is very mischievous. So when he was traveling in China, he noticed that everybody was talking, like especially young people. They don't see Americans that much. So they're very curious. They're very very good-natured people, but they're just curious about this, alien who has showed up, and they would talk about him. So what he would do is that he would be sitting in this, subway, and whole bunch of kids are talking about him. He knows that they're talking about him. He doesn't know what they're saying, but he knows that they're talking about him. And when his stop came, he had learned one word in Mandarin, which is effectively, "Oh, really?" Okay, so he would, after in the middle of it, when somebody says something and his door opens, he would say, "Oh, really?" and then walk out. So the moment he said, "Oh, really," everybody would jump up because say, "Wait a minute, he's been understanding everything that we've been saying." Okay, so there is a way of using both ways in both directions.
Just on that, I got as far
Yeah.
as what I need. Hello, and I. That's all I learned. So.
All right, next up is David.
Hi, I'm sorry I missed the beginning part of the presentation. I was wondering if you, in talking about emotion, pointed out whether or not there's really a clear definition, because it's used in so many different ways, and even in the science, I'm not sure it's really clearly sussed out. So I think of emotion as a pressure, an urgency to do. So I don't think of it as one of the presentations said it's a bunch of molecules that are flying. Okay, that doesn't really help me much because everything is a bunch of molecules. It didn't really there was no content to that. So I think of it as an immediate felt, that's the important thing, infusion of what could be energy or heightened time pressure, right? So that would often be called arousal, which is suddenly occurring, an impetus, immediate impetus or urgent reaction to act or to attend to, right? Which is another way of acting, like when it isn't clear even what to do. But it's that immediacy, a felt infusion of a stimulus. So it's like a reflex. It's before it's reinterpreted, and it's due to some sensation or impression already perceived with some initial consequential significance of hurting or something, or a raw interpretation, not processed cognitively. So beyond that initial, it's a fear of loss, a fear, which is the threat of loss, sadness, it's the awareness of an already present loss, thrill because of a potential benefit, also apprehension because of confusion in what the assessment even is of the change. And the fact that it's an immediate reaction to a stimulus. And we know that consciousness, the brain, can stimulate itself. So you immediately have this potential that it could be an intentional thought has triggered this, or it could be unintentionally. So it could be like reflecting on something. You can realize you're in a dangerous situation, or unintentionally by ruminating in a way you don't control, you can feel emotion. So this can become pathological if it's something that isn't placed under a degree of conscious control, how much ruminating is done. But it's the exact same thing. It's the immediately felt arousal or immediately felt pressure, right? Now, the thing you had us watch, he wanted to say it's not felt, because he wants to talk about something pre-felt. I really feel there's something, if that's a definition, I want to know what's behind that, because when there's pressure on me, you could say it's before I feel it, that the pressure's there, but actually it's the pressure because that's what is present for me. That's the immediate presence, is that pressure. Now, if I don't feel the pressure, what are we talking about? Is that a clear question?
So, I mean, I understand what you're getting at, but the question, I didn't hear a question there. But so first, let me say this: that emotion,
No,
we haven't gone into emotion. I know one of the preparatory references I gave talked about emotion, but that reference was more for what happened at the end. Now, in this talk, we haven't talked about emotion. What we have talked about are information and signals, and emotions ultimately arise out of information and signals in different parts of the brain, and they actually have to be in higher parts of the brain. So we avoided this.
You're going to get to that. That's what you're saying. So I don't mean to jump.
I'm avoiding it for some of the reasons why you're raising, because emotion is difficult, and we don't really need to for this discussion. We don't need to go into emotion necessarily, because at the base of what we're talking about, emotion is information. Okay, and the pertinent idea to understand about emotion is that emotion tends to have it doesn't always, but it tends to have, oftentimes it has, a physical connection. So for example, if you feel scared, your heart might be racing, or some part of your physiology might be in a heightened sense of stress, some type of stress. So in that sense, the emotion you feel, fear, or even excitement can have a similar.
I think it's a little short to call it just information. It actually is a force to act. So it's more than just an information. It's actually a force.
So you're getting ahead of things. So what I'm trying to get us to do is to slow down what happens in the brain. Because when we look at outside behavior, when we look at outward behavior in people, and we see so for example, the example I gave, I don't know if you were here when I talked about affect, right? So when we see the affect on a person's face, when we see the response and the reflection of the internal mood and internal emotions, you might say, the state that they have inside the brain, that doesn't arise instantly. There are multiple layers of processing that happen in the brain. And one of the latter stages is this creation of affect on their face or somewhere on their body.
So let me ask you, when you say immediately, do you mean immediately for the conscious person or immediately for an instrument measuring signals going through an animal?
So so the conscious person so our consciousness is all the way at the end of this chain of events. Okay. Our consciousness awareness, one of the things that I've been trying to describe tonight is that our conscious awareness is all the way at the end of a lot of these things that are happening. Okay. So it would not be for the conscious person. But again, that phrase for the conscious person actually can be taken many ways. So for that conscious person, it would be in lower parts of the brain before it reaches our consciousness. It would be in the lower parts of the brain, and it would be there as information. And eventually that information will coalesce and combine with other things which might generate an impetus for them to take action. So the emotion that you're talking about taking impetus, that impetus is a subsequent later process that develops. All emotions don't necessarily have to have an impetus.
So just to check, your definition of information is the presence of a chemical signal. That's
of a signal. It doesn't matter what form it's present in. Yeah. Information can be present in.
Information is any chemical transformation. Okay.
It doesn't have to be chemical again. It doesn't have to be chemical.
It has nothing to do with awareness, consciousness, and all that stuff. Okay.
No, those are different things we talked about. So that information eventually does go into awareness and consciousness, but at the earliest levels, most of the early levels, you wouldn't necessarily have what we think of as emotions. Okay. Eventually you'll have emotions, but even that, this is the difficulty. I mean, I'm getting into areas that are really difficult to talk about because most of us, when we think of the word emotion, okay, and if I say the word emotion, 5 of you will have different ideas. There'll be 5 different versions of what I'm talking about.
Okay. Of course, that's why we need a definition, because everyone.
Sanjay, let me interrupt just for a second. Could you handle the moderating? I need to take a call.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, Sanjay, I agree. It's often mistaken to include secondary responses to the initial response, and that's a confusion because the ensuing and extended reactions, which occur in light of actual behavioral cognitive operations, which are assessing what are my available responses and then reframing what's going on, create new emotions. So I don't think we want to confuse the initial stimulus and emotion with subsequent states.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the initial stimulus. The stimulus is what goes into the body, and the stimulus will go into the lowest part of the brain, but it will generate. So let me try to think of a different. Let me try to give another example.
Too, right? The brain can create those too, right? So that's
let me give another simple example that might start to, go into exactly the difficulty we're talking about. And it's not simply the stimulus, it's not simply the signal. It's higher than the simple signal. So let's say a frog. Okay, frogs tend to have very simple brains, just in terms of the number of neurons that they have. We don't believe and we see no evidence that they have any type of intellectual consciousness. They have physical consciousness, just as most animals with a brain, but they don't have any cognitive or intellectual or higher order consciousness. But frogs do have a sensation of hunger. And probably they not only have a sensation of hunger, they probably also have an emotion of hunger. Okay, and this is where it gets tricky because I'm using the word emotion in a way that most of you probably don't use it. But it's more akin to the way that I'm describing what an emotion really, the precursor or the first stage of emotion in any animal is. But that emotion of hunger, that want, you might say it's a want. Okay? Want can be an emotion, or you can have an emotional want, right? So that frog having a want to eat something, okay, is a sort of emotion. Now, in humans and primates and higher organisms, mammals, most mammals, that want goes to many, many higher levels through further processing and even through, and it may actually be subverted, it may actually be quashed. So, for example, if you just had a huge meal.
Why are you calling it a want? Does it go to a hippocampus?
No. So I'm not going to go into the brain regions because it's not the hippocampus doesn't come into play here. I mean, the hippocampus come into play in so many areas that it's not specific to this. It's not specific to.
Sorry.
It's not the amygdala either. I mean, amygdala comes into response, certain types of responses, strong responses, but it's not the only thing that has emotions, right? But amygdala, many people understand that amygdala tends to provoke a lot of our emotions. But so a frog. I'm not aware of frog neurological anatomy. I think it has it doesn't have the amygdala like we do, but it has regions that probably act in the same way. So if you want to say that is where this want comes in, no, that's not what I mean. That's not that the amygdala has more of a physiological response to fear. It doesn't have it doesn't have an emotion. It creates the emotion in us. Anyway, I think we're going off on a tangent. Let's try to stay on the topic. So, Madeline, I don't know if Madeline who raised their hand next. I think, actually, DLJ, you already answered, and then Laura, you're next.
Am I up?
Yeah, if you have a question or comment.
Yeah, I always have trouble logging in. I don't know why, but I do. Give me a minute.
Well, we can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm looking at something. I read recently that essentially when you have pain, it takes over the brain, and that's, I guess I would say yes, that one. And so I'm looking at
Wait,
the notion.
what was that word? I didn't hear the word. One word, napping, did you say, or what?
It said, the article talked about the fact that an individual who has, somewhat intense chronic pain, the brain, it takes over the function of the brain, basically, because that's all you can feel is the pain. And so obviously it can't be that that's all it is, right? Because, I mean, in some sense it does do that, but you still have to have the ability to have other emotions and so forth and all these other functionalities, right? So how does that work? I mean, if it says it takes over the brain, I mean that the brain takes over. And I can understand that because it sort of takes over in the sense that it's always there and present, and you always sort of have to think about everything relative to that thing that the pain is there. That will impact how you feel, how emotional you can get, how vested you can get, what you were able to do, willing to do, can do, etc. So how does it work then? I mean, you don't have different brains functioning, but yet you can still feel emotion, you can still react to things, you can still have joy, but at the same time, I guess it's mitigated in some ways by the pain will say how much you can have of all of that, I guess. And so how does that work?
Yeah, so this is an example where probably the article you read was written by a science journalist, and the phrase they use, take over the brain, is it gives a connotation of what they're talking about, but it may mislead us into thinking that it literally takes over the brain. They're not saying it literally takes over the brain. What it means is it becomes so when you have a pain, and especially this does depend on the level of pain, depends on your level of pain tolerance. For each person it's different. But let's say that the pain is so strong that they're not able to do much else. That's what they're talking about. That when this article said that it takes over functions, it doesn't mean it literally stops everything else in the brain and the only thing that's happening in the brain is pain. That's not what it's saying at all. No. What happens in pain is that, and this is not necessarily just with pain, it's with many other types of signals also. It can be with, let's say, feeling to vomit. That's a totally different type of signal that's coming from our body. But that can also, you might say, it might take over everything about you, because if you have a really, really intense feeling of nausea, that's going to stop you from doing anything, right? So just as an intense feeling of pain might stop you from doing anything else. So in a sense, it's not stopping your brain. It's not turning off or circumventing or thwarting any parts of your brain. All that it means is that it's such a strong feeling that it minimizes your ability to focus on other things. Now, if you're strong enough willed, you still can focus on. And this is what happens when, for example, when women are in childbirth, or if you have an accident, you break your arm, and you have to wait for the doctor to put a cast on, or to put your arm. If your shoulder is dislocated, and the orthopedic surgeon literally has to shove your shoulder back into place. It's extremely painful, but you can still do things at that instant because you have the ability to still function at some level. The pain is so strong that it prevents a lot of activity, but through focus and through concerted effort, you can still do certain things that are really important at that time. So it's not that the brain shuts down. That's not the right way to interpret it. I think it's sad because a lot of these phrases that are used in articles tend to portray things not as they are. So hopefully that corrects that.
Well, yeah, but you have to consider when somebody has chronic pain of that order, that's of that intensity. How does that work?
So that's a whole different area. But in chronic pain, what happens is, and chronic pain is more, if you want to think of it, you want to think of it as a habit as well as pain. These two things coming together. So the pain literally becomes a habit. It becomes a physiological habit. In my years ago, I did a talk on habits. I think I did more than one. And in that, I tried to elucidate this idea that a habit can be physiological also. It can be encoded in the brain. So that's a situation where if that pain is so frequent, it can actually be encoded into the brain as a habit. And that's one of the reasons why we have phantom pain, because when the pain, after somebody, a Vietnam veteran or any kind of veteran, if they have a limb amputated, sometimes they still feel pain from that because that's where the pain is habitual. It's not physical, but the brain has been in this state of feeling that pain for so long that it's automatically generating that pain, even though the original cause of that pain is no longer there. So there are a lot of, disparate processes that can be happening. And each of these are different conditions. So a person with chronic pain, there's something wrong in their body that's causing that chronic pain. A person who has phantom pain or even phantom chronic pain has two things wrong in their body. So all of these things are multiple, different types of things that are not typical in the brain of the body.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So Madeline.
Thanks, Sanjay. This is very, very interesting and informative.
Thanks.
So first, on chronic pain, if you still have the thing that's causing the pain going on, and it's going on for months or years, it's signaling your body to respond. You want to do something, and the thing is that there's nothing to do. So I guess you probably have some whole set of feedback loops of suppressing the impulse to do something, because any response that you have really isn't going to help. It's not like you've got an arrow stuck in your calf and you can just pull it out. So I think that probably complicates things, is because then you have this whole suppression loop going on. In order to function, you have to ignore the command to do something. So I wanted to go back to what David was saying, that our conscious minds, or let's say our executive function, it's what the two of you were talking about, are sort of the end result of a long process. And I thought that was very interesting because in the articles or the videos I'd watched before the meetup, I had the impression that we were going to be discussing how the mind can control the body. And it was very refreshing that I wasn't hearing about that this evening. Instead, I was just hearing about how it all works together as a system, and or even just like what the components of the system are and how we talk about them, or how neuroscientists talk about them. And so then I was thinking, it's sort of as if, the end result of the process is like the tip of the iceberg. And it thinks it's the thing that's deciding where the whole iceberg is going, or that it should be the thing that's deciding where the whole iceberg is going. And so if I just do this like this, if I just do this kind of meditation, or say this affirmation, or organize my filing system better, or get a better job, that's the thing that's going to steer the whole iceberg. But in fact, it's a big, now I'm just going to drop the whole iceberg metaphor. It's a whole big feedback loop going on that is continually affecting the end loop that thinks it's the thing in charge. So thank you.
You're welcome. So let me expand on that. It's even more complicated than that. So I don't know if you were here at the very beginning of the talk, but I talked about how the brain has multiple regions and how consciousness has multiple layers, both of those ideas. And then we elaborated on this idea that some of those multiple layers also include the body. So that's where we are. So, and you raised the idea of feedback loop. So that's important. I didn't mention that, but that's I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible, but it is a feedback loop. But in the sense that once you have some type of awareness of something in the world, and it goes into either your subconscious or ultimately it might go into your conscious. And if that's something that's important to you, okay, just for one example, if it's something important enough, that important information then will be put back into your brain as memory, as a remembering. Or it might be a subconscious memory where you're not aware of it, but this is where habits form a lot of times. Our subconscious memories are what ultimately are habits. So that is where the feedback loop is. But we have to remember that there isn't just one feedback loop. There are multiple feedback loops. You can think of each of the different regions of the brain having their own feedback loops as well. Some regions of the brain may have multiple feedback loops, especially the prefrontal cortex, the executive function is doing so many multiple things simultaneously. That's why it's called executive, because it is doing very complex tasks in terms of making sense and allowing us to function and planning, etc. So it's doing multiple tasks. So that area of the brain seems to be having multiple feedback loops simultaneously because it's taking multiple pieces of information. It might be taking the information from our body as well as taking a different piece of information from memory, integrating those, and that's a feedback loop. And then it might be taking the information from the body alone and taking something from our amygdala, and that's a separate feedback loop. And both of these are simultaneous, relatively simultaneously in the prefrontal cortex, while there's a different feedback loop in other parts of the body. So yeah, feedback loops are a part of how our brain functions, basically in everything it does, everything our body and brain does, or regulatory systems. That's what a feedback loop is. It's a regulatory system. So another way to say that idea that I asked everyone to put a pin on about the brain, the one of the, and this is a theory that's been put forth by several prominent neuroscientists, but the theory is that, and it's a respected theory. It's not in the fringes. It's accepted by a lot of people actually. So this theory says that one of the possible reasons why we may have human type consciousness, higher level consciousness, is that it helps us to pick and choose from all of the nonsense and all of the extraneous stuff and all of the noise of information and feedback loops that's happening within the brain. It may be a mechanism to help us to focus on just a few. And the reason why we want to focus is because one of the purposes of the brain is to do feedback loops, is to do regulatory activity, is to do control activity. You could think of regulatory activity as controlling functions. The way we walk is by balancing movement and balance. Okay, and we have to balance the two. We have to regulate both, and they're both two independent systems. And each of those systems have to be regulated amongst themselves and co-regulated with each other. That's what requires walking successfully on 2 legs or 4 legs, anything. So that's an example where a simple task as walking is really a regulatory process, but everything our brain does is regulatory. So this feedback loop idea is important, but it's a different way, a more complicated way of looking at it.
Wonderful. Sanjay, let me ask you one question. How much more time do you have for the presentation itself?
So I can wrap it up. I think I have probably 3 more slides. It shouldn't take more than 15, 20 minutes. So I know we're running close
How
to
about
10.
this? Folks, just hold off the questions. Let's finish the presentation, and please hold on to the questions. You can ask the questions about this and about everything else. So when you come back, it'll be Madeline, Bob, and David, and then we will go from there. Go ahead, Dave, Sanjay.
Okay, let me continue then. Okay, so hopefully everything is visible. Sorry, this. Okay, so we were talking about where we left off. We were talking about that the mind and body has separate states, has separate information that it processes. In the brain, this can exist at the subconscious level as well as the conscious level. Now, our body sensations can evoke consciousness. So here's an example. This is a simple example that I'll give, and that's that. Many of you have heard probably that when someone passes out, when they faint, for example, there may be somebody on the field playing sports and they pass out. They get hit in the head, they pass out, and they're literally unconscious on the field. And somebody may bring smelling salts to them, but waft them under their nose, and they come to. They wake up. They come to consciousness. So this is an example where the sensations from our nose can control our consciousness. And last month, we talked about the opposite, where our brain can control our consciousness. Okay, so we have 2 examples where our brain can control consciousness and where our body can control consciousness. So the smells from that smelling salt goes into the olfactory system. It goes through multiple levels of processing. And ultimately what it does, one of the things we believe it does, I mean, we know it does, but there may be other things that are tied with it, but it's smelling salts basically are an irritant. They almost always have some type of ammonia. And ammonia is an irritant both in our nostrils and our breathing passages, but also in our lungs. So if there's enough of it, and when a person is subconscious, when they're passed out, they're still breathing. So when you put the smelling salt under their nose, the vapors will go into their lungs, into their nose and their lungs, and it will act as an irritant. And that irritant will create other sensations in their body. Again, sensations. So the smell is one type of sensation, and the other irritation sensations there. They can be painful, but they don't have to necessarily be painful. They can be other sub-pain threshold sensations. But they all go into different parts of the brain. And if they go into multiple parts of the brain, the pain centers as well as the smell centers, if they go into 2 parts of the brain, then you have multiple parts of the brain being activated at a slight level. And eventually, it will cause the person to wake up because these signals are strong. The irritations are strong enough. The irritation and the possibly pain is strong enough that it gets attention of their awareness. It tries to go into their awareness, and it kind of kickstarts the awareness part, almost like a reboot of a computer. It kind of reboots that part of our mind which is conscious. So what this says is that when a person is unconscious, many parts of the brain are still active. By the fact that they still have a heartbeat because the brain controls the heartbeat, the fact that they still have a pulse and a respiration, etc. Many things, their digestive system, many things about their body are still functioning because the brain parts are still functioning. In many cases, they can still might be perceiving things around them. They might have a hazy, fuzzy kind of interpretation, but they're still getting a sense sometimes. If you ask them later on, sometimes people say, well, I had a sense that something was going on. People were around me and they were looking at me even while they were passed out. So in some sense, their sensory inputs are still partly working. But this type of smelling salt is something that jogs their conscious mind, where the signals from their unconscious mind, the subconscious, jolts into the conscious, but the conscious isn't awake, it isn't alert, it isn't doing anything. It's kind of off for whatever reason. And actually the reason is because the blood flow to that part of the brain had been turned off. That's why we faint, because the blood flow literally turns off. If the brain doesn't have blood flow, it doesn't have oxygen, it can't metabolize, it can't burn energy, and it can't function. So the brain needs oxygen, it needs energy to function. So we faint because of that. So if the prefrontal cortex fainted, or more than that part of the brain fainted, we've lost consciousness. And then the smelling salt kind of jolts it back into awareness, because the breathing actually, what it also does is it increases the amount of oxygen in the blood. And part of that oxygen will definitely go to the brain also. So there are multiple factors that go into bringing us back into consciousness. So this is an example, again, where our proprioceptory system, our exteroceptory system kickstarts consciousness. Anyway, this goes into a lot of what I was talking about smelling salt. It's a strong reaction that causes the increased breathing. Exteroception, the smell raises us out of a low level of unconsciousness. So this is an example where, I want to reiterate that we've seen an example where a conscious person, can literally make themselves faint, can literally make themselves unconscious. Okay, so the mind can control its own consciousness. And this example is a simple example where the body alone, the mind can be completely unconscious, but just the fact that you're putting sensations into the body, and these sensations initially go into the body and eventually they go into the mind. They don't go. Those sensations don't necessarily go into the brainstem. They do go into the brainstem because that's where all information, ultimately, most information starts and it proliferates to other regions of the brain. But some of that information needs to go into higher levels of the brain, which does the kickstarting of our consciousness. So both of these examples that we have. So there's another slide I had before this, which anyway, let me talk through that. So just a quick idea that I don't have to go into it necessarily, but the information that the brain has and information that the body has, these are occurring at different times, and there may be different levels of information that let me just go back to the previous slide. So information that the brain has, information the body has, are occurring at different levels. One, it's in the body, and second, it's in the mind. So in that sense, there are two different levels. But within the brain, there are also multiple. They can be at multiple levels within the brain also. So you can have multiple levels that the same information can exist at within the body. All of these information can have conflict within the brain. So not just that there can be conflict between the brain, what it thinks, and what the body thinks. You can have conflict within multiple regions of the brain itself. Or some parts of the brain may actually withhold some of that information. It may, for example, past events that have happened in your life may cause you to block out certain sensations. Not just, for example, when people have there's this. I'm trying to think of an example that's simple to. Anyway, so I won't worry about the example, but you can have situations where your mind picks up on it perceives the information from the external world, but it ignores it. And I don't mean just simply the example that I gave where you're sitting on a chair and your body ignores the sensation of your thighs in your body and your buttocks, right? That's one example. But there are other examples, more complicated examples where your mind can ignore information that it shouldn't ignore. For example, if you have in situations of panic or in situations of extreme fear, you may actually fail to see information that's important because you're in such a state. Your mind doesn't want to see that information because it's so terrifying to you. Again, these are not normal; these are exceptional cases, but they can happen. So all of these things bring about very difficult to understand and difficult to assess states within a person's mind and body. And because of that region, the type, exactly, it's what we have to look at is that, and especially these two examples, especially this example where smelling something simple as smelling salt can evoke consciousness. So the question is it that consciousness is only in the brain, or can it also be in the body? Okay, that's what this is. This example raises the question that if the body can evoke consciousness, maybe consciousness is not in the brain, maybe it's in the body. Okay, that's a valid question that comes out of this. And the slide that I had was going to go into a little more of that, but anyway, I'll try to talk through it. The reason why we believe that's not the case, that consciousness resides in the body, it's not true, is that oftentimes the information in the body is partial. It's less accurate than the information in the brain. And oftentimes, as we've discussed in some of the questions that people asked, the information in the body leads us to the wrong conclusion. It leads us to incorrect information. So the information the body has about the world is less accurate and oftentimes less useful to the organism than the information the brain has. The brain has information that it processes more, and again, it goes through multiple layers of processing, so it also can be slower at time. That's the reason why our reflexes happen so quickly, because it can be instantaneous. Whereas, and the system 1, system 2 thinking that we talked about earlier, the system 1 thinking can be relatively faster, much faster than system 2 thinking, because system 2 thinking goes through multiple more layers of processing and feedback loops, you can say. But these are the reasons why it's believed that the consciousness resides more than likely in various parts of the brain and not in the body, because the brain has to be involved in some of these types of processing. And there are other examples where we can actually use the other information in the brain to cause changes in brain states and changes in consciousness using information that doesn't exist in the body. So there are multiple reasons why we believe that consciousness is more than likely in the brain. And actually, I've mentioned this earlier. One of the reasons where it's believed to exist, it's believed to exist in more than one region. One of the reasons is the prefrontal cortex, but there are a few other reasons that it seems to be coexistent with. They work together to give us a sense of consciousness. Anyway, winding down, we talked about the levels of the brain having different levels of consciousness and also different parts of the brain. And depending on which parts of the brain are operating at a given time in parallel, cooperating and in interference, we can have different types of mental states. We can have different types of consciousness. The physical and mental states that our brain has and our body has are multimodal, and they partly can be measured. Some of these can be measured. The mental states are less measurable. The physical states are more measurable. These do happen simultaneously. They can lead to conflict because we have, in the different parts of our brain and body, we have an independent awareness of the world. We have an independent idea of what's in the world. And there can be interference or dissonance between these different parts of the brain. And sometimes they can lead to disorders. We talked about those. And then qualia, we've talked about that also earlier. So anyway, let's end there and see what questions this provoked.
All right, folks. So it's time to continue with the Q&A. Next up is going to be Bob, followed by David. Bob, go ahead.
Sanjay, this may be a repetition of my previous question. Does mental fatigue exist? For example, if I'm adding a lot of numbers and I do that for 10 minutes, I may get tired of adding numbers. Is it my brain that is tired, or is it my body that is tired? I wonder if you could comment.
So yes, the brain, it seems that the brain is getting fatigued. And again, fatigue, the word we're using in a broad way. But if you think about when or in what situations the brain would get fatigued, right? Usually it's when either it doesn't have enough energy, right? And that can be due to lack of sleep. It can be due to lack of energy. Rarely do you have, so if you think about what's happening when you're doing a lot of mental calculation, let's say that you're taking an exam, a 3-hour exam. Okay, that's a more concrete example, which many people would have mental fatigue toward the end of that. If you're taking a 3-hour exam, what you're doing is your brain is burning a lot of energy continuously for 3 hours. So your body really is using up a lot of energy, and your body really is low on energy. It's not just that you have mental fatigue, your body literally is on low energy. Our brain is one of those organs that really uses a lot more energy than, other than the muscle, it uses more energy than most of our other organs. And depending on the situation, it can exhaust us. A long exam is a classic thing that many of us may be familiar with. So it is that energy is low. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect may be that, and this is something that we're not sure, but whenever our brain is doing any kind of processing, there are byproducts of the metabolism. Our brain functions because cellular metabolism happens. Each neuron and other glial cells, all of them are metabolizing oxygen. They're using up energy to do things within the brain to cause activity. And there are residual molecules from these different types of metabolism in these different types of cells. These residual molecules build up in the brain. Okay? And one of the theories around sleep is that it gives the brain a chance to clear up a lot of these residual molecules. And this also gets into dementia, because a lot of the theories around dementia have to do with these residual molecules, not just around metabolism, but other types of brain activity where these molecules collect. And there have been studies that show that certain types of sleep seems to have a slight impact on slowing down dementia, but it's not, these aren't very strong yet, but there's some type of, so anyway, fatigue, mental fatigue, basically creates a situation where your body is low on energy and where your brain has a lot of these excess molecules that it needs to clear up.
Thank you. Next up is going to be David, followed by Vanessa. David.
Yeah, that was interesting on Robert's question. I think that a more intense example might be when there's a need to repeat an activity, a stress, a cognitive repetition has to be done with almost identical data, but with adverse results if you don't get the right sort of calculation. Like, you're doing the same thing, but you get different results each time. And it's important whether you get the correct result out of the same kind of looking data over and over, making these fine discriminations, because a neural path, when repeatedly stimulated, doesn't respond the same every single time. And the signal repeatedly becomes weaker and weaker, right? There's that dying away of the same signal. So it could be like in the brain that creates that stressful reaction, which has to be cleared out over time. What I was going to ask about was we were talking about consciousness of the body, of parts of the body, hands, consciousness of events happening, what to eat and do, all of which depends on, and even threat. X follows Y. This happens after this. Do we have any idea how this fundamental distinction is made neurologically before and after? We say we remember in the brain, we record. This implies that we're doing an ordering in time. How does neuroscience explain that basic relationship of before and after?
So this is getting into the measurement side of what we talked about. I didn't go too much into that, but there's really the tools we have today in the modern world, the most advanced tools that we have limitations. And the limitations they have is in terms of resolution, meaning the smallest area, whether it's a single neuron or not, the amount of area that we can look at. They have limitations in the time domain. They have, again, the resolution in time. What's the smallest amount of time that we can measure? And the third is in terms of energy and activity. Which neurons are active and how much are they active? These are three types of measurements that are very common that we need to do, that we've been doing, but each of these have different limitations. And you talked about time, and that's something that we don't. MRI systems are relatively slow, although MRIs can be taken at the fastest tens of milliseconds, but they can't really be much faster than that. I mean, that's relatively slow.
It's the different. I don't think I'm not sure you're answering the thing that's very close to, but the different issue. Not which sequence of things happen in the brain, but how does the brain represent the memory that this is before this, which is the critical difference between two things.
Okay, that I didn't hear earlier. Okay, so yeah, so this is really this is it's going to require me. I won't go too much into it, but I just need to shift gears a little bit. So when our brain is active, okay, and again, using Madeline's example, we talked about the brain having multiple feedback loops going on simultaneously. When all of that is happening, other parts of our brain are keeping track of the state, the status of some of those feedback loops, okay? And in a sense, that status is the type of memory you're referring to, okay? It's not memory, it's short-term memory basically, okay? And it's not stored in, like any other type of memory that we have a conscious memory of. But that memory is helping. It's there, not at a conscious level. It's subconscious because we're not aware of that memory existing, of those ideas existing, of that information existing. But that information is needed and used by the various parts of our brain, and we don't know for a fact where that memory resides. We don't know. We have no way of knowing right now. And again, even the possibility that this memory exists is a theory, but it's really a plausible theory, because without having that memory, without, it's we don't know how else the brain would. It's almost impossible for the brain to do any kind of complex series of activities without it keeping intermediate states, without it keeping a memory of its intermediate states. So we know there has to be some type of memory, and we know the brain has short-term memory in other contexts. So it's reasonable to say that it does, but we don't know.
It's the whole idea of things happening in sync with the way it has it recorded, so that they can be matched up the way you line a ruler up and say the mark and the mark. So it has to be about rhythm of things, internal and external, matching up. Right?
So that depends on, so the rhythm, when you're talking about the time sequence, depends on the type of information. So for example, if you're talking about sounds, okay, or memory of a person's voice, that is dependent on sound and the speed of sound. Not the speed of sound, the speed of time in our mind. It's depending on time, and so that would be, we believe there would be markers in memory that help you to synchronize things. Okay, so the memory would also have to encode time as a part of it, or you might say synchronous elements of time. But there are other types of memory that don't involve time.
That's what I'm asking. Do we know anything about that time marking?
So I remember reading some papers on this months ago. I don't think I can talk about it intelligently right now.
Thanks. No, that's great. Thanks, Sanjay. That's interesting. Thank you.
Right, and again, this gut feeling, what it basically means is that a part of my brain remembers certain things, but I don't have conscious awareness of what is in it. But that memory is kind of giving me this gut feeling. Okay, well, so my gut, that's why
I think that's sort of funny. And you did say that the cortex, is responsible for a lot of things, a huge number of things. But I can tell that in a large number of people, not you, but a large number of people, it really doesn't do much of anything at all. In fact, they're probably very rarely conscious, if at all. I've noticed that a lot.
I would not agree with that. I know you're trying to make a facetious statement, but it's and even a political statement, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, no, our conscious mind is aware and doing a lot of things, but not in the way that we think of consciousness. Consciousness, again, in the previous talk we had, I don't think you were in that, even the higher level human type of consciousness can be split up into many different sub-processes. And some of those processes are fairly low level, which I think most people have. So when you're saying that type of consciousness, a lot of people don't have, I would disagree with that. I think you raised your hand again.
No, he's giving a thumbs up. So actually, Shrikant stepped away for a moment. Next up, we have Vanessa.
Okay, let's see if we're going to end on a simple question. This
I
may be
don't know,
something
DOJ? Was DOJ, sorry, Vanessa, was DOJ before you?
I don't think.
I wasn't.
I think after David, I see, he made a comment. I don't know if that's just a comment.
Yeah, just a comment, but I did ask Shrikant permission to say something at the end, Joe. So if you
Sure.
do that, thanks.
No worries.
Sorry about
Okay.
that. So Vanessa.
Well, this is maybe an example, maybe more of in tandem than in parallel, where you talk about kind of the body, the gut response. Is there's been times I'll be on the bus and I may nod off sign and wake up as if a nap, but there'll be other times I'll like snap awake realizing because I'm pitching forward, whether the body feels like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna fall over where I'm sitting on the bus. Obviously, the worst thing is I may be uncomfortable, but it's like that snap being almost like a jerk, forcing me to be awake. Either the body says, you got to readjust yourself, you're falling. And even when I've had dreams where maybe, let's say, something where I might be stumbling down, something where it's beyond tripping, but not something like I'm falling off a bridge that normally I wouldn't wake up for, but it's like, I'll jolt up, I'll jolt up out of the sleep, just like, you have a dead battery, but you get that you give it a jump and then the battery's working. And, I'll have far worse dreams where maybe I wake up suddenly from like a nightmare, but it's not like I sat up in bed, like, holy shit, I'm falling down and realize, wait, I'm in my bed. But it's like, until that brief moment, the body kicked in and said, either causing that movement, like the inner ear, you readjust yourself so you don't fall. I mean, is that maybe a basic possible example of, the body and mind kind of not jiving with each other till you become aware and realize, oh, wait a minute, I had a dream, I was falling, and that's why I'm sitting up in bed, not dreaming, not sleeping nicely like I was, like, a nanosecond or maybe even a millionth of a nanosecond where you had that before you had the connection and the mind realizes, okay, you sit up, okay, I'm no longer falling, but I was never falling in the first place. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. So I didn't catch a question in that. I mean, what you said is completely true, that when people are in various states of unconsciousness or semi-consciousness, there's information that can jolt them into consciousness. Yeah.
Well, I meant, is that a possible example when it's the body, like you mentioned, the body sometimes can experience something separate than the mind, like very basic thing, that the body really, like I said, more on the bus, when you're dreaming that involves the mind, but if you're on the bus, you somehow sleep, you're slouching forward as you fall asleep and relax. It just have to weigh the position you take. And it's not like I wasn't trying to fall asleep one way or the other, but I realized, suddenly the body felt like it was falling. And that triggered a response for the body to act. Whereas, I wasn't, it was just simply the position of my body. Somehow it felt either was falling, so it told the brain, do something. I mean, could that be the case? I mean, it's something like, it's a possibility, but, no one's really that concerned with researching it. I'm just talking about the bus ride, the change, the body like pitching forward to think it might be falling. If I was awake, I know, well, I'm not falling down. I'm just okay. Maybe sit up straight. Your mom saying, stand up straight. You're going to kill your back.
Well, that's really an example of, the example I gave with the bicycle, it's a very similar example where your proprioceptory system is sensing, is always awake.
Mhm.
Sorry, not awake. It's always active.
Yeah.
And working. Even though your conscious mind is semi-asleep or asleep, other parts of our brain are active. So when I said earlier, many parts of our brain are always active. Even when we're asleep, there are many activities in many parts of our brain that are active. So That's an example where the proprioceptory system and possibly the exteroceptory system both are able to pick up stimuli. So, for example, if your back is touching the seat rest on the bus seat, right, and if you start to fall forward, then your skin on your back will sense a change in sensation and pressure. So that's the exteroceptory system. Your balance system in your ears will sense that your head is wobbling in a different way. So proprioceptory systems. So both these systems will immediately activate the sense in your mind, that already exists of your state, of your status in the world, differs from those two systems. And that's going to jolt you into a state of consciousness. So that's similar to the example I gave earlier. Yeah, that exactly would happen. So I mean, this has actually been studied and this is understood well. Yeah. So if you're asking, I mean, you asked why hasn't this been studied? It has been studied.
Oh, no, I meant, was it worth, doing a deep study of, like I mentioned, is it really, is it the separate thing, or like you mentioned, it's the other things that are still active, but the mind is in its own place, not being aware, I'm not aware of it. Like you said, if you're asleep, you're not aware of the body moving, like conscious of it, I should say that, the mind does not sleep, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I should say.
It's been studied repeatedly, yeah. So this is something I think that's pretty well established. Not necessarily as the bus example, but there are many other examples of our systems of information that our body collects, and it jolting us, affecting our consciousness. So, yeah. Thank you. So, Joe, is there anyone else?
No, DLJ. Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, I asked Shrikant's permission to do a shameless plug. On Saturday, there's a link there in the chat. Yeah, I'll be doing a talk on roughly the same subject from a bit of a different angle. And I could do with some intelligent people to give it a peer review. So if you guys know any intelligent people, please invite them.
Well, folks, if you know any intelligent people, go ahead and invite them to DLJ's upcoming meetup. Yeah, sorry, Sanjay, a little bit late, but yeah. Did you, really quickly, did you cover up the difference between thoughts, desires, and mental states at all?
So no,
mental, physical states. Yeah.
So yeah, mental, physical states I did go into. So what I'm doing is so I'm trying to look at consciousness in more detail, and I'm doing it step by step. So I'm starting with, and again, it's not extreme detail. It's for a general audience, so we can't go into too much detail. But we're going into we started, several talks back. We started with the physical states, physical types of consciousness, and how consciousness appears, and how we are affected by consciousness, etc. So starting with the physical and going slightly higher and higher and higher. And so now we're getting into the physical as well as mental. Okay. And then in subsequent talks, I'll go more focused into the mental aspects of consciousness, which itself is a huge set of ranges. And that will probably take many, many, many discussions, at least 5 to 10 maybe. I'm not sure exactly. I haven't thought through the ways I'll demarcate those or split those apart, but yeah. So thoughts, desires. So you asked about thoughts and desires. So those are higher level.
And emotions as well. I mean.
Right. So David was also going to emotions. Yeah. So these are higher level processes, and I don't consider them really. I mean, we can think of them as parts of consciousness, but I'm trying to explain this and look at this purely from the notion of. I'm trying to think of what word to use, because consciousness is a loaded word. Just the aspect of not what exists when we have consciousness. I'm not looking at it from the point of what occurs in our brain when we have consciousness. I think that's where your question is coming from, is that when we are in a conscious state, there are many types of ideas. There are many types of energy states that can occur in the brain. Some we can think of them as thoughts, as desires, as emotions. And I can go into those. Actually, let me add that to the list it will be a little different than what I was thinking of, but I think we can add it still. I think it's important because other people may have similar views on this.
Yeah, it might be interesting to go into, just different theories that actually explain that phenomena between the relationship between those things.
So the difficulty here is that I'm not aware of any one theory that completely explains these. So all that I'll be able to offer are theories, the ideas, the prevalent ideas that have been put forth, and we don't know for sure. That's the problem.
Right. Any theories stick out for you? I mean, we've covered some, right?
So yeah, I mean, I've touched on many things, but not in not focusing on trying to explain thoughts, desires, emotions from consciousness point of view. I've discussed those outside of consciousness, just in general in the brain, how thoughts and emotions can exist in the brain. And really, for neuroscientists, they don't see a difference between the two. It doesn't mean there isn't, but so far we haven't seen a difference, and it might be true that there is no difference from the perspective of the brain. And again, unrelated to consciousness. But when we put this within the framework of consciousness, and specifically the framework of an intelligent, conscious human being, or primate, advanced primate, that's where we have to. It will be difficult to go into that because there are a lot of other things I have to explain about consciousness. So that's going to be later. Yeah, we can't. I mean, like for example, one of the ideas about regulating thoughts. So regulation in general, feedback loops and regulatory cycles. That's something that's important. So we brought a little bit into that tonight. I'm going to try to do more of that because, like for example, if you anyone who knows about emotions knows that emotions can't stay within the brain by themselves. They basically subside and kind of dissipate within about 30 seconds in everyone's brain, no matter what it is. Okay? For an emotion to stay in the brain, it has to be active, not actively as in thinking wise, but there has to be a process in the brain that keeps it alive. Okay? And I suspect many people who know about emotions understand this. So that's an example where this regulatory view of consciousness is important to explain how emotions can be kept in a conscious mind. But then, what happens to those emotions, right? If it would depend on what types of regulatory processes are keeping it alive. If the regulatory processes come from deep down in the brain, you'll have one set of outcomes for that emotion. You'll have one set of results of how that emotion stays or what happens to it, how it changes, versus if that impetus, if the drive for those emotions to be there come from higher states, they'll cause different behaviors within the brain, and therefore the emotions will exhibit and manifest in different ways. So not just the fact that you have an emotion isn't enough. Those emotions change over time. One example, the simplest example of emotion changing over time is that it subsides and then dies within about a minute. All emotions do that. So that's a process that happens in every person's brain, every normal brain, that emotions subside and go away. But if the emotion doesn't subside and go away, it can be retained and kept and re-energized in many different ways. And how that happens depends on which other parts of the brain are active in that role. So it's going to get complicated talking about these things. And that's the reason why I didn't want to go into some of these, because just to talk about that one idea of how do our mental processes within our conscious brain, within the conscious regions of our brain, how do they remain and how do they change and flow, right? How do they evolve and become other things? It won't be just one discussion. It's going to be a lot of discussions, just that one idea. And I don't know if people are going to have the patience to go through all of that, but I'll try to touch on those. It's important. I will try to touch on it.
I think it would be interesting. I mean, I think one way of approaching it would probably be talking about the different theories that explain mental states. Like, so there's identity theory and there's emergent theory, and then maybe comparing and contrasting those things and how they actually work. Could be one approach that you could take, or how functionalists look at it. I think that these are all different theories, and not necessarily where there's common agreement. So I think that this is something that I see David had his hand up. You want to ask a question, David? Go ahead.
Just one quick point before that. Sorry, David.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm trying to do, because as we get deeper into consciousness, this area is going to become so much more difficult to talk about. So one of the things that I've done, I didn't realize this until you said this, until you asked the last part of your question, but what I've been doing, I didn't realize this, but now I realize I'm doing this, is that I'm trying to focus on only ideas that have some type of acceptance or basis in the neuroscientific community.
Okay.
So, and the reason why is because if I go beyond that into psychology, into philosophy, into even quantum mechanics and quantum physics, if I go into the many different areas that have delved into consciousness, it becomes too complicated and too difficult to have any conversation on. So that's why I now I realize that I've been, and I plan to, but I might, based on what you said, I might revise that. But my initial goal is to keep it tied to neuroscience, because then it at least becomes somewhat manageable.
Yeah. So, because we've covered emergence here in the past, right?
Yeah,
and I think
yes.
we've covered functionalism, I believe, in the past
Yes.
as well. So
I,
two of the three have been covered. Yeah.
So I talked about the theories of consciousness, in general, several times, and I described them, but I didn't tie those into the conscious awareness. That's the part that I haven't done. So that's what I thought you were asking about, which if I do that, tying in with conscious and the multiple types of theories, I still will have multiple theories within neuroscience, but if I expand it to multiple theories even outside of neuroscience, it's going to become very unwieldy. That's the concern I had.
Yeah, that's fair.
I'll try to do as much as I can.
Yeah, it's just I'm just thinking about the more importantly, I was just more interested in thoughts, emotions, obviously for a lot of different reasons, and brain states, primarily because of even and desires, because some of this stuff so bad. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I think, a lot of those questions, Joe, are important because it's the important part of what I think we talk about when we talk about consciousness. So, the nearer we can get to clarifying what parts of feelings and all the different aspects of what we can interface with in our brain, finding out how to speak about consciousness seems like a worthwhile thing. So I think, for example, like we talk about dreaming, it's a nearly fully conscious state, because although you are not tied to external stimuli as the source of the stimulation in that environment, and you're likewise not particularly recording to make the memories, it's still, you are experiencing decisions and indecision in the moment. You are weighing choices, you're judging, you're reacting. You have the full range of emotions and valuation and reason going on. And it would be interesting to make a distinction between that and the external form of consciousness, which we, use for our experience in acting in the external world. It can still make a distinction in a dream state between what we consider present and what we are thinking and what was recollected. So we know presence is something seems real in the dream state. It's kind of the way it seems real when we're experiencing anything. And then we have to ask, are we delusional when we're awake?
Right.
We don't ask that, so we have that potential to tell the difference that something's present as opposed to merely subject to recall or being imagined. We make that distinction. So we know what our mental life is like as we're dreaming. We know what we're like as we're dreaming. We have all this information, and yet there's something a little different. Is that worth calling conscious? Seems to me it's like the full range of consciousness, just an internal experience.
Yeah, so this is the difficulty. So just you focus on dreaming, and as you were speaking, there were ideas that I had, which if you understand the full gamut of what dreaming encompasses,
Yep.
some of the things that you said don't really apply, right? So lucid dreaming, for example, but when you said that when you're dreaming, you're really not reacting to the outside world. In some cases you are, but you're not. And we see this in animals, we see this in people. The types of reactions can be purely cognitive reactions. Sometimes reactions can be actually physical reactions. So the person who's sleepwalking actually is reacting to the outside world when they're dreaming.
But there are aberrant states of dreaming. I'm talking about. Those,
yeah, but David, no, but you can't just call it.
Example, we talk about 5
But you can't just call it aberrant states. You can't just call it an aberrant state, because every mind is capable of doing these things. Okay, even normal minds are capable of doing these things in certain situations. So it's not that the minds are diseased. It's not that.
We're all capable of psychosis. It's totally true. Or false memory, or everything.
Right. So that's the reason why, to have a cohesive theory, that theory needs to be true and needs to be complete in every scenario that you can encounter. That's the reason. That's the reason why this is so difficult to do, because if we're going to focus only on dreaming, we can't say, well, dreaming excludes external stimuli. It doesn't, because when you're dreaming, you said that when we're dreaming, we're not reacting to the outside world, which would mean that in a sense, you're implying that it would exclude external stimuli. And that wouldn't happen, because when we're dreaming, this is the reason why sometimes when you're dreaming and your partner or a child or someone or your pet makes some kind of sound and you wake up, because your mind is still.
It's the process. Yeah, you leave the room. You're not in that room anymore. I agree.
Right, but it happens while you're dreaming. It's not that your dreaming ends and then you hear it. It's simultaneous to your dream state.
When I'm playing the piano and there's a noise, it distracts me from the work and the thing I'm doing. There is a thing called dreaming, though. So let's not say there's nothing called dreaming. It's a different kind of state, right? Okay. I think you're sort of. I'm taking dreaming as what it's for.
No, I know, but we can't see, when you're studying something intently, you can't take a simple explanation of it and run with it, because it's only as accurate as your simple. It's only as accurate as your simple explanation.
You do define a maximum in calculus without taking all of the aberrant cases into account.
But you actually, at some level, you have to, and to the level that you don't.
If you understand the first level, you have a basis on which to build. But there is a first level.
So to the level, So we're going to do the first level. That's what I've been doing, and probably more. But the extent of the levels that you incorporate in your theory and understanding provides a basis for how correct that theory is. So if you only go to a certain level, 4th or 5th or 6th level, your theory will be only correct to that level. And anything that you exclude beyond that, like real events that are beyond the 4th or 5th level, if you exclude those in your theory, then your theory has holes in it. It may not be as accurate beyond that.
So what is this? Well, the question essentially was, in what sense is dreaming not fully a consciousness?
Is not fully a consciousness?
Full state of consciousness.
Is not fully a full state of consciousness. So my initial answer, or the reaction of the answer that I was going to give wasn't going to be easy. It requires a lot more knowledge. So I'm trying to pare it down to the level of understanding that I think everyone has so far. And given that, it's going to be too simple an answer, I think, but I'm going to have to give it anyway. I can't go too far deep into it. But I'm going to give one idea that is going to help explain why it's more complicated than this. So when we're dreaming, we can think of it as an altered state of consciousness. We can think of it that way, okay? Because one of the things that I've said, actually, I think I said it in the last talk, and I've said it in prior talks also, is that consciousness is not only conscious. Consciousness also has subconscious components to it. And this is something that a lot of people may not understand, but if you go back to the previous talk, I explained it there, and I think more than a year ago I explained also, but if we need to, we can go back to. So this is something important to understand, is that consciousness includes subconscious behaviors and subconscious
Structure.
information processing in the brain. Okay, so you can think of dreaming as a subconscious level. It is a subconscious level of activity, of processing. So in that state, it falls within consciousness. So you can say it's a part of consciousness, but it's not a part of the higher consciousness that we think of. See, this is the problem with the words, right? We're talking about words. The word conscious isn't one word. We're stuck using one word, but it's more than one. So I'm going to use subconscious consciousness. Dreaming definitely falls under that, okay? And it might fall under conscious consciousness if you consider that the dreaming is driven by information that's in the brain, and that information in the brain may temporarily rise either from memory or from external stimuli that you're getting while you're sleeping, while you're in the sleep state. You might be getting external stimuli that rises to not all of the regions of your conscious mind, but some of the regions of your conscious mind. And then they fall back down into your subconscious to help you make decisions about what happens in the dream. Right? See, this is why it gets complicated, because when you talk about multiple regions of the brain operating simultaneously, and if you take the region that, let's say, encodes consciousness, okay, which the prefrontal cortex is one region, okay, but there are several other. There's a default mode network. There's several other regions that there are different theories. There actually isn't just one theory. So depending on which theory, the different regions of the brain. Even the insula is a part of one of the theories. Which insula is a part of the brain which actually deals more with the body, but one theory considers that as part of consciousness also, meaning the body is considered part of consciousness. So this is one of the reasons why the talk tonight, I didn't go into this part because it requires a lot more advanced ideas around the insula. But talking about dreaming itself parts of it can occur temporarily at a conscious level, but most of it occurs at the subconscious level. So if you want to ignore the part that occurs at the conscious level, this is what I was talking about if you want to ignore levels 4 and 5 and 6, then your understanding is only as good as level 1, 2, and 3, and it ignores levels 4, 5, and 6. So if you want to ignore that parts of dreaming occur at the conscious level, at the highest level of consciousness.
So what is the deficit in dreaming that you identify that calls it dreaming?
What do you mean opposite? I don't understand.
The difference between what I am now and dreaming, how would you define the difference in those two states?
So the most holistic view that I have of consciousness is that it's actually not what we think of it as. Okay, we think of consciousness as well, let me explain. We think of consciousness as we fully know what's going on. Okay, I'm really aware of where I am and what I'm doing. That's how most people think of consciousness. A lot of neuroscientists don't think of consciousness that way. They think of consciousness closer to what the average person thinks of dreaming as. That it's just another state of mind.
So they're more pro-dreaming as the definition they would use, and you would hold a different standard, which has to do external physicality and self-awareness in that context.
Well, I would use the levels of the parts of the mind and the levels of processing that's happening. And again, it's not easy to talk about those because really we don't know how many levels there are. We have models. We have many models of the different parts of the brain, but we don't know which model is fully right. I mean, all of the models work to some extent. So we can simplify and talk about 5 models, five parts of the brain. That's what I did for this talk. But, it depends on which models you talk about. That's what it shifts the view that you have and how you can discuss these ideas. It's complicated. This is why, because a lot of these things don't have definitive answers. They have a lot of good theories, and a lot of these theories are close to, they're reasonably explainable.
Maybe you need more than one theory.
Yeah. Well, likely many of these theories have elements that are true, but none of these theories are completely true yet. Yeah, it's complicated. So this is what worries me because this topic is not going to be easy to get to the end of, and as we have any conversation, it's going to be easy to lose people, and I don't want to lose people. I want to have everyone understand what we're talking about. And so if we don't want to lose people, we're going to have to be interrupted, and people are going to ask questions about what this means. What we
Yeah.
just talked about, David, right? I mean, I think you understand what I said, but there may be other people in the discussion who missed some of that, and they need things explained again. It doesn't mean they're not smart. It just means that the way that they see things doesn't match the way I see things, or other scientists see things. So it doesn't mean right or wrong. It just means, how do I get this idea into your mind so that we can share this idea and discuss it?
We're all matching our paradigms here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
All right.
it's getting late. Yeah, it's getting late. I was going to ask you, when you were talking about smells, like when I walked into my friend's house, I remember my high school years almost when his parents, what the relationship was there, but it's getting a little late for that. But that was pretty, because you did cover some of that with, as far as at least smelling salts that I did see briefly.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a quick, and I won't go too much, but basically, if you think of the concept of loops, of our brain has processing loops. What I mean, not just is that it theoretically can have, what I'm saying is that it always, at every given second, it has multiple processing loops active at any given time in the brain. That's happening, and I'm talking about advanced brains, mammalian brains usually. So there's multiple levels of processing that are happening in every brain. So when you smell something that brings back memories of high school, one or more of those loops have become activated, which threw off other loops, which are unrelated to the smell, but they're related to memories. And it may be that cascade of throwing off other loops, there may be more than one of those. There may be multiple, which eventually gets to a memory that's strong enough. And then that memory comes to the forefront and into your consciousness. So there's so many different paths that one smell can take to get you to your remembering your high school days and that specific memory of your high school days, that it's difficult to talk about it. But we can talk in general that the smell is a loop process, which evokes other loop processes, which ultimately will bring out memories from your core, from your stored memories of your past life, of your high school days and other things. And one of those brought out memories will form a loop, will exist in a loop, which will maybe get stronger, or it'll bring out another loop, which ultimately will be strong enough to get into your consciousness. And then you'll become aware that smell made you remember that thing.
Yeah, I forget.
How about I give a real world example?
Sure.
One thing that he talked about was the brain and exhaustion. And this is my little world example. I have brain damage, and I'm trying to find out where certain things are located, whether there are therapies that I can do to improve things. So I started the test once and I was falling asleep, and so we had to stop it. So I decided to go again, and I did it. And I know certain areas I really did poorly in. And when we were going over it, she was looking at it. I was telling her things that I hope to work on. And she said, well, all of these things can be worked on, most definitely, but you are suffering from severe sleep deprivation. And until that gets dealt, until that gets overcome, they will not even begin to work with me, because my brain is too tired and it cannot function in any possible positive way. So I thought that was a really good answer to my problem, why my brain was feeling fried all the time lately. And I don't feel so bad that it's happened. And there's your example about when you said the brain can get very tired. And why and how it gets tired is obviously overwork, but also lack of sleep is very, very dangerous for, keeping your brain out of, a cloudy state.
Yeah. I mean, sleep is one of those things that affects everything about the brain. So again, the loops that we have, the processing loops that we have in the brain in real time, all the time, they can get slowed down. They can become less efficient if you're sleep deprived. So a lot of things that the brain does when it's stable and it's in a comfortable state, it won't be able to do the same things when it's sleep deprived. So yeah, sleep is a essential element.
And that can affect your dreams too, right?
It can affect everything, yeah. I mean, it can suppress dreams. It can suppress the memories you have of dreams. Like, they say that not everybody remembers the dreams that they had, but many people do. But if you do remember let's say you remember every one of your dreams, if you're sleep deprived, chances are you won't remember some of your dreams that night because of the sleep deprived state. So there are a lot of things that happen normally in a person's brain that when they get into a severely sleep or even a regular average sleep deprived state, a lot of things in the brain won't function properly.
It's weird that I only remember one dream ever, and it's has a similar strange theme to it, and I don't know why it's happening, but it's definitely ongoing in this sleep deprived state, and it's a very peculiar dream, and it's a weird, it's weird. That's all I can say. It's got parts of, my family involved. My mother's still present in this dream, and she died at 74. And it's like it's almost hallucinogenic in that sense, the way it's constructed. And I don't know. I don't know what kind of awareness it would be if it was. It is. Maybe I'll have to analyze it and see
Yeah,
where
so there are theories that say, so sorry.
there are theories. Well,
Laura, are you done, Laura? I couldn't hear you. You were still speaking, so sorry about that.
no, I was just kidding. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think my view is that, your consciousness is based also on the context that you're in at any time. And, the answer of what consciousness is will vary each time along the spectrum. So, but I think you also build up, a bank of things that represent whatever, and you pull from that every time you enter a new state of consciousness or a new context as you grow and develop. So I think, but those things, you set, you have bank to that, will probably come to light, and you'll be changing them because you've grown, but you have some basis to work from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think you
Well,
can consciousness very easily because of that.
no, I think there are a lot of different areas that that this will take a while to cover. I think
Well, I mean, I don't think we're going to be able to get through everything. I mean, my goal is not to try to give everybody a full understanding of consciousness. We can't do that. I mean, it'll take probably years to do that, and even then, it may not be possible. So my goal is to go into specific areas to try to help people understand in general how our brain works. I mean, my goal for using consciousness is as a tool to help us understand the brain itself. I don't think we're going to be able to understand consciousness itself in this group or most groups. It's too large a topic, but there are still many areas of consciousness we'll cover. But it'll be a tool to understand things.
Careful, because Saturday night, I think that we may actually crack it. So I'm just guessing here. So it's that's possible. Anyway.
I didn't look at the Saturday schedule, but yeah.
But in any case, so I'm going to go ahead and announce. And since you mentioned loops, I'm also putting our optometry on that'll be on. I think it is at 8 o'clock. I don't know. For some reason, I thought it was earlier. Anyway, it's Don Bredell, and he'll be back. And he was here a couple of weeks ago, and explaining field theory, essentially, from what I gather. And it was a complex topic, and it was a wonderful topic. He really covered a wide range of things, and he related it to a number of areas. So I encourage everybody to attend. That is on Sunday. And we also have Seneca's letters tomorrow. We also will be we've cross-posted the Asian philosophies group on Saturday with Zhuangzi. I think we're actually on chapter 6, if I remember correctly. So that those are our upcoming events. I don't believe we have anything on Wednesday or Friday. So I hope to see everybody around soon. Thanks again, Sanjay, for your time this evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Take
Sanjay.
care.